1. Inko Midoriya would later say that she knew something was different about her son before he ever spoke his first word. It was not a matter of pride, the way other mothers spoke of their children's early steps or early smiles. It was a matter of the living room curtains, which on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon had changed from pale yellow to a soft green while 4-month-old Izuku sat propped against a cushion, staring at them with wide, unfocused eyes. She blinked, certain she was imagining things, and called her husband that evening only to have him laugh gently and suggest she was simply tired. But 3 days later it happened again, this time with the pattern on his own blanket rearranging itself from stripes to small stars while he fussed in his crib, and Inko understood that she was looking at something no amount of exhaustion could explain. The doctors at the Quirk Development Clinic were cautious in the way doctors are cautious when they do not yet have language for what they are seeing. They ran the standard scans, checked the boy's toe joint for the telltale signs of an early quirk, and found nothing unusual there at all, which only deepened the mystery. Whatever ability Izuku carried did not seem to announce itself through the ordinary channels. It simply existed, quietly reshaping small, forgettable details of the world around him, as though the boy's mind and reality itself had been introduced to each other a little too early and were still working out how to behave. It was not until his 3rd birthday that anyone understood the shape of what he could do. He had been reaching for a cake with white frosting, the kind Inko had specifically chosen because Izuku loved vanilla, when his small hand closed around empty air instead of the plate. He had wanted chocolate. He had wanted it so plainly and so completely that the frosting simply was chocolate a heartbeat later, rich and dark, as if it had always been that way. Inko stood frozen with the knife still in her hand, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The report she eventually filed with the Quirk registration office used careful, measured language, because she did not yet trust herself to describe what she had seen without sounding as though she had lost her mind. She wrote that her son appeared to possess a quirk capable of small-scale alterations to physical reality, activated by focused desire, and she requested confidentiality pending further evaluation. The office granted it. In a world already full of monstrous strength and living flame, a toddler who could change the color of a cake seemed, for the moment, like the least of anyone's concerns. That changed the day Izuku, not yet 4, watched a delivery van run a red light and clip an elderly neighbor crossing the street. Inko heard the scream before she understood what had happened, and by the time she reached the front gate her son was already standing on the sidewalk with his hands out in front of him and tears streaming down his face, and the neighbor was sitting up on the pavement completely unhurt, blinking in confusion at a van that had somehow stopped 3 full meters short of where it should have struck her. Nobody outside the family ever learned exactly what Izuku had done that afternoon, not even Izuku himself, not fully. He would only say, in the halting words of a frightened child, that he had wanted her to be okay so badly that wanting had felt like the only thing in the world, and then she was okay. Inko carried him inside and held him until his sobbing slowed, and it was that night, rocking him in the dark, that she began to understand what she was raising. She took him back to the clinic the following week, and this time the doctors did not treat the visit as routine. A specialist in quirk theory, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Tsukachi's colleague, sat with Inko for nearly 2 hours asking careful questions, and by the end of it he told her plainly that what her son possessed was not a minor talent for small cosmetic changes. It was, in its earliest and most undeveloped form, an ability to rewrite localized reality according to intention, limited for now by a child's fragile grasp on cause and consequence, but with no theoretical ceiling that he could identify. He recommended, gently but firmly, that she consider enrolling Izuku in a specialized monitoring program. Inko refused. Not out of stubbornness, but because she had already seen, in the exhausted slump of her son's small shoulders after saving a stranger's life, exactly what unchecked use of this power cost him. She did not want her son turned into an experiment, a weapon, or a headline before he had even learned to tie his shoes. She wanted him to have a childhood first, and control second, and she told the specialist as much in a voice that did not waver. He respected that, in the end, though he asked to check in periodically, and Inko agreed. What followed was not the story of a prodigy paraded before cameras, but the quieter, harder story of a mother teaching her son, alone in their small apartment, the most dangerous lesson there was, that the fact you can do something does not mean you should, and that wanting is not the same as needing, and that the line between the two would decide the entire shape of the man he was going to become. Izuku, for his part, absorbed this lesson the way he absorbed everything, with the same intensity he would one day pour into filling notebook after notebook with hero analysis. He did not think of his quirk as impressive. He thought of it as heavy, something that pressed on him whenever he so much as considered using it carelessly, a weight his mother had taught him to respect rather than resent. By the time he started elementary school, he had learned to keep it folded away entirely, a secret held so tightly that even his closest friend at the time never suspected he had a quirk at all, let alone one that could, in theory, unmake a city block if he ever let his intentions run wild. That friend was Katsuki Bakugo, and in this particular telling of events their friendship did not end the way it might have elsewhere. There was no cruel nickname born from Izuku being quirkless, because Izuku was not quirkless, not remotely. There was, instead, a different kind of tension, quieter and stranger, the tension of a boy who could see that his best friend was holding something enormous behind a carefully shut door and did not understand why he refused to open it. Katsuki noticed things. He always had. He noticed the way Izuku sometimes flinched when a ball rolled toward a small child in the street, as if resisting the urge to simply will it to stop. He noticed the exhausted, glassy look that crossed Izuku's face on the rare occasions he did use his ability, small things, a scraped knee healed a little faster than it should have, a broken toy quietly whole again the next morning. He asked about it exactly once, when they were 7, sprawled together in the shade of the neighborhood park watching hero footage on Katsuki's tablet. Izuku had gone very still, and then, in a small voice, told him the truth. He told him about the cake, and the van, and his mother's rule that he was never, ever to use it just because he wanted to, only when someone truly needed him to. Katsuki had listened with an expression Izuku had never seen on him before, something almost solemn, and then declared, with all the certainty of a child who had already decided his own destiny, that Izuku was going to be the greatest hero in the world and that he, Katsuki, was going to be right there when it happened, so Izuku had better not screw it up by being scared of his own power forever. It was not kindness exactly, not the soft kind anyway, but it was loyalty, fierce and immovable, and it planted something in Izuku that would not fully bloom for years. For now it was enough that someone else knew, that the secret was not entirely his to carry alone, and that his best friend had looked at the most frightening thing about him and decided it made him not a monster but a hero waiting to happen. The years between that afternoon in the park and the day the acceptance letter to UA High School arrived were not eventful in the way stories usually demand. They were built instead from 1,000 small disciplines, morning stretches to build the stamina his mother insisted mattered even for a quirk that seemed to bypass ordinary physical limits, evening sessions where Inko would set a single glass of water on the table and have him practice nudging its temperature by exactly 1 degree, no more. Because precision without restraint was worthless and restraint without precision was just as dangerous. He learned, slowly, that his quirk responded not to raw desire but to a strange alchemy of clarity, need, and cost. The clearer and more necessary the intention, the more readily reality seemed to bend, and the more it took from him afterward, a bone-deep exhaustion that could leave him unable to stand for an hour after even a modest alteration. He learned that he could not create something from nothing, not truly, not life, not a person's feelings, not memories, though he never dared test that last limit directly, some instinct in him recoiling from the very idea. He learned that the world, it seemed, had rules even for him, and that those rules mattered more than anything, because a boy who could rewrite reality without limits was not a hero. He was simply the next disaster waiting to happen. By the time he was 15 and sitting for the UA entrance exam, Izuku Midoriya had become something rare even among the extraordinary, a quiet, watchful young man who had spent a decade learning to distrust his own strength, and who was about to walk into the one school built specifically to teach people exactly what to do with it. 2. The written portion of the UA entrance exam had never worried Izuku. He had spent so many years cataloging heroes, their quirks, their weaknesses, the physics of how they moved through the world, that the questions felt almost like an extension of a hobby rather than a test. It was the practical exam that made his stomach tighten as he stood in the staging area with hundreds of other applicants, all of them shifting nervously in the cool morning air, waiting for President Mick's voice to crackle through the speakers and send them into the mock city. He had promised his mother he would be careful. He had promised himself the same thing a dozen times over on the train ride there, running through the mental checklist she had drilled into him since he was small. Use only what the moment requires. Never for spectacle. Never for advantage over another person. He intended to keep every part of that promise, and for the first 2 minutes of the exam, he very nearly managed it through ordinary effort alone, dodging a 2-pointer robot with a footwork drill his mother had taught him and dispatching a 1-pointer with a textbook strike to an exposed joint. Then he turned a corner into a wider avenue and found himself face to face with the exam's infamous 0-pointer, a building-sized machine grinding forward with slow, deliberate menace, and beneath it, pinned by a fallen support beam, a girl with brown hair and wide, frightened eyes who was struggling uselessly to free her leg. Izuku did not think. That was, perhaps, the most important thing his mother's years of training had actually given him, not caution in the moment of crisis but instinct, a body and mind so thoroughly rehearsed in restraint that when restraint was no longer the priority, something clearer and simpler took over. He crossed the distance between them at a dead sprint, dropped to his knees beside the beam, and did not try to lift it with his hands. He wanted it lighter. He wanted it desperately, completely, the way he had once wanted an old woman on a crosswalk to be unharmed, and the beam responded, its density dropping just enough, just briefly enough, that he could shove it aside with his shoulder and drag the girl clear a half-second before the 0-pointer's massive foot came down where she had been lying. The machine kept advancing, but its size, which had made it so intimidating a moment before, was now simply a lot of moving metal that Izuku understood he had very little time to deal with. He looked at it and felt the familiar heaviness settle over him, the sense of a door in his mind creaking open onto something vast and dangerous, and he made a choice he had never had cause to make before. He did not try to destroy it. Destruction on that scale was still new territory, and testing it in the middle of a crowded exam felt like exactly the kind of thoughtless escalation his mother had warned him against his whole life. Instead he reached for something smaller and far more precise, targeting not the machine's bulk but the ground directly beneath its forward legs, willing the packed earth there to soften, just for a moment, into something closer to loose sand. The 0-pointer's next stride sank without resistance, its massive weight betraying it, and it toppled sideways with a groan of tortured metal, crashing harmlessly into an already collapsed storefront instead of continuing its advance down the avenue. The ground firmed up again almost as soon as Izuku released his focus, because he had learned long ago that changes like that did not like to be permanent unless he specifically willed them to be, and permanence always cost more than he wanted to pay for something as simple as passing a test. He staggered, his vision swimming at the edges, and felt a hand catch his elbow before he could fully lose his balance. It was the girl he had pulled from beneath the beam, her own fear replaced now by something closer to astonishment, and she was saying something to him, "Thank you, are you okay?" that he only half registered through the exhaustion pressing down on him like a physical weight. "I am okay," he managed, which was not entirely true, but true enough for the moment, and then a proctor was there, and points were being tallied somewhere he could not see, and the exam noise faded into a dull roar around him as he sat down hard on a curb and put his head between his knees until the world stopped tilting. He did not know, in that moment, that the recovery camera's position throughout the mock city had captured every second of it, or that in the observation room high above the testing grounds, a small mouse-bear dog creature sitting in a chair far too large for him had leaned forward with sudden, intense interest, murmuring to the woman beside him that they needed to review this particular applicant's footage very, very closely. He did not know that All Might himself, watching from a separate monitor as part of his ongoing informal consultation with the school, had gone very quiet at the sight of a 15-year-old boy softening solid earth to sand and briefly altering the density of a steel beam with nothing but his bare hands and an expression of pure, desperate focus. All Izuku knew, sitting on that curb with his pulse hammering and his limbs trembling from a cost he had never paid at that scale before, was that he had done what needed doing, and that the girl he had saved was crouched beside him now, insisting on staying until he felt steady enough to stand, introducing herself as Ochako Uraraka in a voice that was warm and a little embarrassed and utterly unbothered by the fact that the boy who had just saved her life was currently too dizzy to remember his own name for a few seconds. The acceptance letter arrived 12 days later in the strange, holographic form UA favored for its incoming students, projected from a small device onto the wall of the Midoriya apartment while Inko hovered nervously in the kitchen doorway. All Might's own recorded image appeared first, larger and more vivid than Izuku had ever seen him even on television, and delivered a message that made Izuku's chest go tight with something between pride and disbelief. He spoke of villain points and rescue points both, of a young man who had chosen, in a moment of genuine crisis, not to simply defeat the obstacle in front of him but to protect a stranger with a precision and restraint that older, more experienced examinees rarely showed. He spoke of a total score that placed Izuku not merely among the admitted, but near the very top of his year, and then, almost as an aside, almost gently, he added that the school's faculty would like very much to speak with Izuku and his mother in person before the term began, not out of any concern, he assured them, but out of simple, professional interest in understanding an ability as singular as the one they had witnessed on exam day. Inko cried, the way she always cried at the important moments, quietly and without any attempt to hide it, and pulled her son into a hug so tight it nearly knocked the wind out of him. Over her shoulder, Izuku caught his own reflection in the darkened television screen, a skinny, freckled boy who did not look, in that instant, anything like the vast and terrifying potential the specialists at the clinic had once warned his mother about. He looked, if anything, faintly stunned, and deeply, quietly happy, and for the first time in a long while, not afraid of what he was. 3. The meeting with UA's faculty took place 3 days before the start of term, in a conference room on the school's top floor that smelled faintly of green tea and old paper. Present were Principal Nizu, whose small, sharp eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of Izuku's posture within seconds of his entering the room, the homeroom teacher assigned to Class 1A, a tired-looking man named Shota Aizawa who studied Izuku with the flat, unimpressed expression of someone who had seen a great many promising teenagers overestimate themselves, and, seated slightly apart from the others in a chair that seemed too small for his frame even in his less imposing form, All Might himself. Nizu did most of the talking at first, laying out in careful, measured language exactly what the school hoped to understand. They were not interested, he assured Inko more than once, in exploiting her son's ability or parading it before the public before he was ready. They were interested in helping him develop it safely, within a structure built specifically to handle quirks that carried real risk to the user or to others, and they wanted, more than anything, an honest account from Izuku himself of what his quirk could and could not do. Izuku answered as best he could, haltingly at first and then with growing confidence as he realized no one in the room was reacting with fear or suspicion, only genuine, careful curiosity. He described the way his ability seemed to respond to focused, specific intention rather than vague wishing, the exhaustion that followed any significant use, the hard limits his mother had helped him identify over the years, no creation of matter from nothing, no direct alteration of another person's mind or memory or consent, no permanent change to another living person's body without their agreement, boundaries that felt less like rules imposed on him and more like walls the power itself seemed to respect. All Might listened to all of this with an intensity that made Izuku faintly nervous, and when Izuku finished, the hero leaned forward and asked, in a voice far gentler than his usual booming public persona, whether Izuku had ever considered what his ability might mean for the kind of hero he wanted to become. Not the flashiest hero, All Might clarified, not necessarily the strongest in a straightforward contest of power, but perhaps the one best equipped to prevent disasters before they finished happening at all, to reshape a collapsing building's angle of fall, to soften the ground beneath a falling civilian, to buy precious seconds in situations where seconds were the only currency that mattered. Izuku had never quite framed it that way to himself before, and something about hearing it said aloud, by the man he had idolized his entire life, settled a question he had been quietly carrying since childhood, the question of whether a power built around such careful restraint could ever really be heroic in the way strength or speed obviously was. All Might's answer, offered without hesitation, was that restraint was not the opposite of heroism. It was very often the hardest and most necessary part of it. Aizawa spoke last, and more bluntly than either of the others. He told Izuku plainly that a quirk like his was, in his professional judgment, one of the most dangerous in the room, not because of any flaw in Izuku's character, which seemed steady enough, but simply because of its raw ceiling, and that Aizawa intended to watch him closely during training, not out of distrust but out of the simple mathematics of risk. He added, almost as an afterthought, that if Izuku ever caught him using his own erasure quirk on him during a lesson, it was not personal, only precaution, and Izuku should not take it as an insult. Izuku, somewhat to his own surprise, found that reassuring rather than alarming. It meant someone else in the building understood exactly how seriously his ability needed to be taken, and would not simply assume, the way strangers sometimes did when they learned what he could do, that vast power made careful oversight unnecessary rather than more essential. The meeting ended with an agreement, informal but clearly meant to be binding, that Izuku's specific quirk details would remain restricted information within the school for as long as reasonably possible, disclosed to classmates only as Izuku himself chose to disclose them, and that his combat and training exercises would be structured with an eye toward control and precision rather than raw output, at least until the faculty had a clearer sense of exactly where his limits actually sat. Walking home that evening, Inko slipped her hand into her son's the way she had when he was small, and asked him quietly how he felt about everything that had just been said. Izuku thought about it for a long moment, turning the question over the way he turned over every question that mattered to him, and admitted that for the first time since the cake incident all those years ago, he felt like the people around him understood his quirk as something to be shaped and guided rather than either celebrated or feared outright. It was, he said, a strange kind of relief, to finally be somewhere built to hold something as large as what he carried. Term began 3 days later with the usual chaos of new students finding classrooms and new teachers taking stock of new faces, and Izuku Midoriya walked into classroom 1A carrying a secret that would not stay a secret for very much longer, though he did not yet know exactly how, or through what door. The truth of what he could do was about to walk out into the light of his classmates' curious and searching eyes. 4. Classroom 1A was louder than Izuku had expected, 20 desks filled with 20 distinct personalities all announcing themselves at once through posture and volume and the particular way each student had chosen to occupy their small allotted space. He recognized a few faces from the entrance exam, including, to his considerable surprise, Katsuki Bakugo, sprawled in a seat near the window with his usual scowl already fixed firmly in place, as though daring the day to disappoint him. Katsuki spotted him almost immediately, and rather than the friendly greeting Izuku half expected after a decade of friendship, what he got instead was a narrow, assessing look and a low mutter that only Izuku was close enough to hear. "So you actually did it? Didn't chicken out?" It was, from Katsuki, something close to a compliment, and Izuku found himself grinning despite the nerves still humming under his skin. He did not have long to dwell on it, because a girl with warm brown eyes and an easy smile was already turning in the seat beside him, and Izuku felt his stomach drop pleasantly when he recognized her as the same girl from the entrance exam, the one he had pulled free from beneath a falling beam. Ochako Uraraka introduced herself properly this time, without the fog of adrenaline and fear clouding either of their faces, and thanked him again, more calmly, for what he had done that day, adding with a small, teasing smile that she still owed him one. Beside her sat a tall, poised girl with dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail, who introduced herself as Momo Yayorozu with the careful, deliberate politeness of someone raised to make a good first impression, though her eyes, Izuku noticed, were sharp and curious rather than merely polished, tracking the room with the same analytical interest he usually reserved for his own hero notebooks. Nearby, a girl with a wide, quiet mouth and faintly frog-like features introduced herself simply as Tsuyu Azui, and asked, with disarming bluntness, whether Izuku's ribbon on his uniform meant he had placed near the top of the entrance exam, because she had heard a rumor about a rescue that sounded almost too dramatic to be real. Izuku deflected as best he could, uncomfortable with the attention, and was grateful when a girl with purple, jack-shaped earlobes leaned across the aisle to introduce herself as Kyokujiro and complain good-naturedly about how early the first day had started, and when a pink-skinned, yellow-eyed girl practically bounced over to declare herself Mina Ashido and ask everyone within earshot what their quirks were with such open enthusiasm that half the room ended up laughing along with her. Somewhere near the back, a uniform floated seemingly on its own, sleeves gesturing amiably, belonging, Izuku would soon learn, to a cheerfully invisible girl named Toru Hagakure. Aizawa's arrival ended the introductions abruptly. He came in wrapped in what looked like a yellow sleeping bag, informed the class in a flat, unenthusiastic voice that the welcome ceremony they had all been expecting was, in his professional opinion, a waste of everyone's time, and instructed them to change into gym uniforms immediately. There would be, he explained, a quirk assessment test, the same one every year, and if UA was going to be worth its reputation, they would treat this like the serious training institution it was rather than the fairy tale their middle schools had probably sold them. The test itself was simple in structure and merciless in execution, a series of standard physical challenges, a 50-meter dash, a standing long jump, a grip strength measurement, each one performed with Quirks fully engaged, all of it recorded and ranked in front of the entire class. Izuku watched classmate after classmate demonstrate abilities that ranged from the spectacular to the subtle, Bakugo's explosive propulsion sending him rocketing across the field, Momo's creation Quirk producing a javelin seemingly from nothing but her own bare skin, Ochako's gravity manipulation Quirk turning a simple ball throw into an absurd, floating spectacle that had half the class laughing in delighted disbelief. When his own turn came for the ball throw, Izuku hesitated only a moment before deciding on the smallest, most defensible demonstration he could manage, a brief, precise reduction in the ball's mass at the exact moment of release, enough to send it soaring an impressive but not impossible distance, nothing that would immediately mark him as anything more than a modest, sensible Quirk user. Aizawa's device registered the throw, and his teacher's eyes flicked toward him for a moment longer than they had lingered on anyone else's result, though he said nothing, only made a small note and moved on to the next student. It was the standing long jump, later in the sequence, that nearly undid Izuku's careful discretion. Distracted by the ongoing chatter of his classmates and momentarily forgetting the specific restraint he had planned to maintain, he pushed off with a burst of instinctive focus meant simply to help his legs, a habit so old and automatic he barely registered doing it, and cleared a distance that made several classmates actually gasp out loud. Aizawa's gaze this time did not move on quickly. He studied Izuku for a long, silent moment, and then, instead of calling attention to it in front of the class the way Izuku half feared he might, simply made another small note and said only, quietly, that Izuku should come speak to him after the test concluded, a request delivered with such neutral calm that most of the class did not think twice about it, assuming perhaps some minor correction to Izuku's jumping form. Ochako, walking beside him back toward the changing rooms afterward, gave him a curious, sideways glance and asked, in a low voice meant only for him, whether everything was okay. Izuku managed a smile he hoped looked more confident than he felt, and told her it probably was, though privately he was already turning over the familiar, uneasy question of exactly how much of himself he was going to have to reveal to the people around him, and how soon that revealing was going to happen whether he chose the timing or not. 5. The conversation after the Quirk assessment test took place in an empty hallway outside the changing rooms, Aizawa leaning against the wall with the particular weariness of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to go before it started. He did not waste time on preamble. He told Izuku plainly that he had reviewed the entrance exam footage the faculty had shared with him before term began, that he understood the general shape of what Izuku's Quirk could do, and that he expected Izuku to stop trying to hide it quite so aggressively during physical assessments, because inconsistent performance data made it harder, not easier, to keep him and his classmates safe. Izuku apologized a little too quickly, and Aizawa waved it off with visible impatience, explaining that he was not angry, only practical. He understood, he said, why Izuku might want to keep the full extent of his ability quiet for now, and he was not going to force a disclosure Izuku wasn't ready to make to the rest of the class. But between the two of them, in training exercises where real information mattered, he needed the truth, not a careful performance calibrated to look ordinary. Izuku, more relieved than he expected to be, agreed. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in Izuku's life, almost normal. Mornings were early and demanding, afternoons filled with a curriculum that mixed academic coursework with increasingly serious hero training, evenings spent finishing homework in a dorm room that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. He found himself drawn most naturally into orbit around Ochako, whose easy warmth made her simple to talk to, and Momo, whose sharp, analytical mind meant their conversations, once they started, tended to stretch on far longer than either of them intended, usually over some fine point of hero strategy or Quirk theory that most of their other classmates found tedious within minutes. It was Momo, in fact, who first pressed him gently, during a study session in the common room roughly 2 weeks into term, about the exact nature of his Quirk. She had noticed, she said, watching him carefully over the top of her textbook, that his registered Quirk description on the school directory was strangely vague, listed only as localized environmental adjustment, a phrase so deliberately unhelpful it practically begged further questions. Izuku hesitated, weighing his mother's old caution against the plain, uncomplicated trust Momo had shown him since the first week of class, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wanted to tell her the truth. He kept the explanation simple, describing his ability as something that let him make small, temporary changes to physical properties around him, weight, texture, temperature, always at a real cost to his own stamina, always within limits he had spent years learning to respect. He did not tell her everything, not yet, not the full scope of what the specialists at the clinic had once speculated about, but he told her enough that her expression shifted from curiosity into something closer to quiet, careful respect. "That's remarkable," she said finally, and meant it, and then, in the same breath, asked exactly the kind of precise, practical question Izuku had come to expect from her, about the relationship between the scale of a change and the energy it cost him, and whether he had ever tested the outer edges of what was possible under controlled conditions. It was, Izuku thought, exactly the right response, curiosity without fear, interest without the faint edge of unease he sometimes caught in strangers' eyes when they learned what he could do. Ochako found out a few days later, in circumstances rather less deliberate. The class had been running a joint training exercise in the gym, paired off to practice basic grappling and evasion, and Izuku, distracted by an unexpected takedown attempt, had reflexively softened the mat beneath himself to cushion a fall that would otherwise have knocked the wind out of him. Ochako, his partner for the drill, felt the strange give of the mat beneath her own knees where she had followed him down, and sat back on her heels afterward with an expression of open, delighted astonishment rather than alarm. "You did that on purpose, right?" she asked, more fascinated than concerned, and when Izuku, a little sheepish, confirmed it and offered the same simplified explanation he had given Momo, Ochako's only real reaction was to declare, with total sincerity, that it was the coolest thing she had heard all week, and to ask whether he could maybe help her practice her own quirk control sometime, since anyone who could manage that kind of precision clearly knew something about fine-tuned control that she desperately needed for her own gravity manipulation. By the end of the first month, word of Izuku's quirk had spread quietly through most of Class 1A, not through any dramatic reveal but through the ordinary, accumulating trust of shared meals and late study sessions and small moments of casual demonstration that came to feel less like secrets being uncovered and more like a friend simply becoming better known. Bakugo, predictably, showed no surprise at all, having known the truth for a decade, though he did take a certain proprietary satisfaction in informing anyone who asked that he had called it years ago, that Izuku had always been destined for something big, and that the rest of them were only now catching up to what he had known since childhood. The one person who did not push for details was Aizawa, who seemed content to let the class arrive at the truth on their own terms and timeline, though Izuku noticed, more than once, his teacher's gaze lingering on him during training exercises with a watchfulness that was neither suspicious nor unkind, only careful, the attention of a man who understood exactly how much weight a single student in his class was quietly carrying, and who intended to make sure that weight never became more than the boy could bear. 6. The trip to the unforeseen simulation joint was billed to the class as a straightforward rescue training exercise, the kind of practical, hands-on lesson UA was famous for, and Izuku had spent the bus ride there flipping through his notes on disaster response protocols with the same eager focus he brought to every new challenge. He had no way of knowing, sitting beside Ochako as she quizzed him good-naturedly on emergency triage procedures, that the day was about to become the first real test not just of his classmates' training, but of exactly how far he was willing to go with the power he had spent his whole life trying to keep leashed. The facility itself was enormous, a sprawling indoor complex divided into distinct disaster zones: flood, landslide, fire, ruins, mountain, each one designed to simulate a different category of rescue scenario. 13. The hero overseeing the exercise walked the class through the facility's layout with calm, careful enthusiasm, explaining the philosophy behind rescue-focused training in a warm, unhurried voice that made even the more skeptical members of the class lean in with genuine interest. It was Izuku, scanning the space below the entry platform out of old habit, who noticed the black, swirling mass gathering in the plaza first, and the cluster of figures beginning to step out of it like smoke taking on solid form. For one terrible, disbelieving second, he thought it might be part of the exercise, some elaborate villain simulation 13 had simply neglected to mention. Then Aizawa's entire posture changed beside him, shoulders dropping into a fighting stance, goggles snapping down over his eyes, and Izuku understood, with the cold, sinking certainty of someone whose instincts had never once been wrong about danger, that this was real. Aizawa's voice cut through the class's confusion with brutal clarity, ordering 13 to get the students to safety and to alert the school immediately, and then, without another word of explanation, he was gone, leaping down into the plaza to meet the growing wave of villains alone, buying time with nothing but his own erasure quirk and years of hardened combat experience against numbers that made Izuku's stomach twist with fear for his teacher. Chaos erupted almost immediately. A massive, black mist creature separated portions of the class from one another with terrifying efficiency, scattering students into different disaster zones before anyone could organize a coherent response, and Izuku found himself falling through darkness alongside Ochako, Tsuyu, and a handful of others, landing hard in the facility's flood zone with the mist creature's ominous, echoing voice fading above them as it withdrew to continue its work elsewhere. There was no time to process fear properly, not with a hulking, muscle-bound villain already wading toward them through the shallow water with obvious hostile intent. Tsuyu moved first, her tongue lashing out to grab Izuku by the collar and yank him backward out of the villain's immediate reach, and it was that single, decisive action, more than anything, that snapped Izuku's own instincts fully online. He did not have time for careful, measured restraint. He had time only for the same clear, desperate need that had once softened a support beam and steadied a runaway van, and he reached for it without hesitation, willing the shallow water directly beneath the villain's advancing feet into something thick and viscous, closer to wet cement than ordinary water, and watched the man's charge falter and collapse as his legs sank suddenly and completely unresponsive beneath him. Ochako, quick to seize the opening, touched two fingertips to the trapped villain's shoulder and released his own weight into near weightlessness, sending him tumbling harmlessly upward into the rocky outcropping above rather than risk a fight none of them were equipped to win outright. It was clumsy and improvised and exactly the kind of desperate, cooperative thinking their training had only begun to prepare them for, and it worked, buying the small group crucial seconds to regroup and assess a situation that had gone, in the span of perhaps 90 seconds, from routine field trip to genuine, life-threatening crisis. Izuku's legs nearly buckled the moment the immediate danger passed, the familiar wave of exhaustion crashing over him harder than he had ever pushed it before, but he forced himself upright, forced his breathing steady, because Tsuyu was already moving to check on two younger students who had been separated in the initial fall, and there was no room yet, not with villains still scattered throughout the facility and their teacher fighting alone against an unknown number of enemies, for Izuku to fully surrender to how much this particular use of his power had cost him. Somewhere else in the sprawling complex, he knew, the rest of his classmates were facing their own versions of this same terrible surprise, and Izuku, gathering the small group around him and beginning to plan, as calmly and clearly as his shaking hands would allow, a path back toward the central plaza where Aizawa still fought alone, understood with sudden, absolute clarity that whatever careful discretion he had maintained about his quirk for the first month of school was about to become the least important thing in the world compared to simply keeping everyone around him alive. 7. The path back toward the central plaza took the small group through the ruined zone, a maze of collapsed concrete facades and twisted rebar that would have been treacherous even without the added danger of villains potentially waiting around any given corner. Izuku led the way with more confidence than he actually felt, drawing on the countless hours he had spent mentally mapping disaster scenarios in his notebooks, translating theoretical knowledge into the kind of quick, practical navigation that might actually keep 4 frightened first-year students alive. They encountered no further villains directly, though twice they heard distant sounds of struggle echoing through the facility's concrete corridors, and once, unmistakably, Aizawa's voice, strained but still fighting, calling out something Izuku couldn't quite make out over the chaos. It spurred them faster, until they reached a final barrier, a section of collapsed wall blocking the most direct route toward the plaza, forcing a choice between a longer, safer detour and a shorter but genuinely dangerous scramble over unstable rubble. Izuku made the decision in the space of a heartbeat. He was already exhausted, already running on fumes after the flood zone, but the sound of the fighting ahead was getting worse, not better, and every second spent on the longer path was a second Aizawa might not have He pressed his palm flat against the nearest slab of fallen concrete and asked it, with the last clear reserves of focus he had, to be lighter, just enough, just long enough, to let the four of them shift it aside and clear a narrow passage through. The effort nearly put him on the ground. His vision swam, his knees buckled, and it was only Ochako's quick hands under his arm that kept him upright long enough to stumble through the gap he had made before it sealed itself shut again behind them, concrete groaning back to its full, indifferent weight the instant his concentration failed. Tsuyu caught his other side, murmuring something reassuring he only half heard, and together the group half carried, half guided him the last stretch toward the plaza. What they found there was a scene from Izuku's worst nightmares given horrifying, immediate form. Izawa stood in the center of a wide circle of downed villains, his own body clearly battered, one arm hanging at an unnatural angle, blood running freely from a gash near his hairline, still somehow upright, still somehow fighting, facing down a hulking, faceless creature unlike anything Izuku had ever seen described in any hero database, alongside a pale, blue-haired young man whose posture radiated a casual, terrible confidence entirely at odds with the devastation scattered around him. Izuku understood, without needing to be told, that this was the true threat, the reason for the entire coordinated assault, and that his teacher, brilliant and dangerous as he was, could not hold out against it alone for much longer. He had no plan beyond the desperate, animal certainty that he could not simply stand there and watch Izawa die, and it was that certainty, raw and absolute, that reality itself seemed to answer when he reached for it one final time, past the point of exhaustion, into territory his body had never been asked to survive before. He did not attack the creature directly. Some instinct, sharper than conscious thought, told him that meeting overwhelming physical power with a contest of force was a losing strategy against something built, quite possibly, for exactly that kind of confrontation. Instead he reached for the ground beneath its massive feet, the same trick that had worked on a lesser villain in the flood zone, willing the packed earth and broken concrete into something loose and shifting, and for one precious moment the creature's forward momentum faltered as its footing gave way entirely beneath it. It was not enough to stop the creature, not by a long shot, but it was enough to buy Izawa the single clear second he needed to drag himself backward out of its immediate reach, and enough, more importantly, for the blue-haired young man's attention to snap suddenly and sharply toward Izuku himself, pale eyes narrowing with an interest that made Izuku's blood run cold even through his exhaustion. "Interesting," the young man said, in a voice that carried no warmth at all, only a kind of clinical curiosity, and took one slow step toward Izuku before the entire plaza was suddenly, blindingly illuminated by a burst of golden light and a familiar, thunderous voice that Izuku had heard 1,000 times through television speakers and never once, until this exact moment, in person, close enough to feel the concussive force of the man's arrival ripple through the air itself. "Have no fear," All Might announced, dropping into the plaza in a crouch that cratered the concrete beneath him, "because I am here," and the sheer, overwhelming relief that swept through Izuku at those words nearly finished what exhaustion had already started, his legs finally giving out completely as Tsuyu and Ochako caught him between them, lowering him gently to the ground while, above them, the number one hero turned the full weight of his attention on the creature and its unsettling companion. Buying, with his sudden presence alone, the first real margin of safety the plaza had seen since the attack began. 8. The remainder of the confrontation passed for Izuku in disjointed, half-conscious fragments, All Might's voice roaring across the plaza, the ground shaking under the force of blows too fast and too powerful for his exhausted mind to properly track, the eventual arrival of more pro-heroes summoned by 13th's alert, and finally the retreat of the mist villain, gathering the blue-haired young man and his monstrous companion and vanishing back into whatever dark passage had first brought them into the facility, leaving behind only wreckage, a handful of defeated lesser villains, and a class of first-year students who would never again think of a school field trip as something inherently safe. He woke properly some time later in the recovery room, his mother's face swimming into focus above him, pale with worry but steady, and it took him a long, disoriented moment to understand that he was not still in the plaza, that the danger had passed, that recovery girl was standing at the foot of the bed checking a chart with the brisk, no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had seen a great many injured heroes in her long career and did not intend to waste sympathy on theatrics. "You used your quirk 3 times in under 10 minutes, at increasing scale," recovery girl told him, not unkindly but firmly, once she was satisfied he was lucid enough to actually absorb what she was saying. That kind of repeated strain is not something your body is built to sustain without real consequences, young man, and I want you to understand that clearly before you go treating today as some kind of victory to be repeated casually. Izuku, still groggy, managed only a small, chastened nod, though privately he could not quite make himself regret any of the choices that had led him here, not when he thought of Aizawa's blood-soaked face, or the creature's foot sinking uselessly into ground that should have held firm. Inko, hovering close beside the bed, seemed to read the thought on his face anyway, and though her hand trembled slightly where it rested against his, she did not scold him the way some part of him half expected. She only told him, quietly, that she was proud of him, and terrified for him, and that both things could be true at once, and that he needed to promise her he would keep talking to her about what this power cost him, rather than simply absorbing it silently the way he sometimes still tried to do. The full class gathered the following day in the common room, a somber, subdued version of their usual boisterous selves, trading fragmented accounts of what each of them had faced in their separate corners of the facility. Izuku listened as Momo described holding off a group of lesser villains alongside Kyoka and Toru using little more than improvised tools and sheer stubbornness, as Bakugo, characteristically, downplayed a genuinely impressive solo defense with a scowl and a dismissive wave of his hand, as Ochako and Tsuyu recounted, with visible pride, exactly what Izuku had done for their small group in the flood zone and again on the desperate scramble to the plaza. It was Momo, in the quiet that followed, who finally asked the question Izuku had been half dreading and half hoping someone would voice aloud, whether it was true, as rumor already whispered through the dorms, that Izuku had actually held off the creature guarding the mist villain, if only for a moment, long enough to save Aizawa's life. Izuku, uncomfortable with the framing but unwilling to lie to people who had just been through genuine trauma alongside him, admitted quietly that he had done what he could, that it had not been enough on its own, that All Might's arrival was what had truly turned the tide, and that he did not particularly want to be treated as some kind of singular hero of the day when every single person in the room had fought just as hard in their own corner of the crisis. It was Bakugo, unexpectedly, who cut through the growing, uncomfortable silence that followed, informing the room bluntly that Izuku had always been like this, allergic to taking credit for anything, and that the rest of them had better get used to it now instead of being surprised later. The comment, delivered with Bakugo's usual gruff impatience, somehow eased the tension in the room rather than deepening it, and within minutes the class had settled back into something closer to its normal rhythm, exhausted and shaken but unmistakably, stubbornly intact. Aizawa returned to teaching within the week, one arm still in a sling, his usual dry impatience entirely undiminished by hospitalization. He said little about the incident directly, beyond a single terse acknowledgement to the class as a whole that they had all performed better than he had any right to expect from first years facing a genuine villain assault, and a private, quieter word to Izuku afterward, delivered in the hallway with characteristic bluntness, that he had noticed exactly what Izuku had done in that plaza, and that they would be talking, soon, about exactly how much further Izuku's control needed to develop before anyone, including Izuku himself, tried something like that again. Izuku accepted the warning with the same seriousness he accepted everything his teacher told him, though beneath the exhaustion and the lingering fear of how close the day had come to genuine catastrophe, something had shifted in him that he suspected was not going to shift back. He had used his quirk, fully and without careful, curated restraint, in front of people who mattered to him, and rather than fear or suspicion, what he had found waiting on the other side of that revelation was something closer to trust, hard-won and real, the first true foundation of the kind of hero he was slowly, carefully, beginning to believe he might actually become. 9. News of the USJ incident could not be kept entirely out of the press, not with a facility that large evacuated by emergency services and a dozen pro-heroes called in on short notice, though UA's administration worked quickly and carefully to control exactly what details reached the public. Student names were withheld entirely from official statements, the school citing standard safety protocols for minors, and Izuku was grateful, in the days that followed, that his own role in the confrontation remained a private matter within the walls of UA rather than a headline splashed across national news. That privacy, he understood even then, was likely temporary. He was, after all, a first-year student whose quirk had already drawn quiet, careful attention from the school's own faculty before term had even properly begun, and he harbored no illusions that a power capable of softening steel and liquefying solid ground would stay hidden from the wider hero world for very much longer. Not once he began appearing regularly in public-facing training exercises and, eventually, real field work. For now, though, he was grateful for the buffer, grateful for a few more months to grow into his own control before the full weight of public scrutiny inevitably arrived. The announcement of the UA Sports Festival came almost exactly 2 weeks after the USJ attack, delivered by midnight during a special assembly with her usual theatrical flourish, and the timing struck Izuku as almost deliberately reassuring, a signal from the school that ordinary life, and ordinary ambition, continued even in the wake of genuine danger. The festival, Midnight explained with evident relish, was the single largest platform available to any first year hoping to catch the eye of a professional agency, broadcast nationally, watched by millions, the closest thing Hero Society had to an annual showcase of its brightest rising talent. The reaction among his classmates was immediate and electric, weeks of quiet post-crisis tension breaking apart almost overnight into something closer to competitive excitement. Bakugo, predictably, declared with total confidence that he intended to win outright, no qualifications, no false modesty, and dared anyone in the room to suggest otherwise. Ochako, for her part, grew quietly, fiercely determined in a way Izuku hadn't quite seen from her before, murmuring to him during lunch that her family had sacrificed a great deal to support her hero course tuition, and that a strong festival showing meant real prize money, real financial relief, real proof that the sacrifice had been worth it. Izuku found himself turning the festival over in his mind with a different, more complicated kind of anxiety than his classmates seemed to carry. It was not fear of losing, exactly, though the ordinary competitive nerves were certainly present. It was the sharper, more specific worry of exactly how much of his quirk he could safely show on a stage broadcast to millions of viewers, agencies, and, inevitably, whatever remained of the villain network responsible for the USJ attack, all of them watching with very different motives for wanting to understand exactly what he could do. He raised the concern with Aizawa during their now regular after-class check-ins, and his teacher, characteristically unsentimental, told him plainly that hiding his ability entirely was neither realistic nor advisable at this stage of his development. The festival, Aizawa pointed out, was precisely the kind of controlled, rule-bound environment where Izuku could begin demonstrating real capability without the chaos and genuine danger of an actual field crisis, and better, in Aizawa's blunt assessment, for the wider hero world to form its first real impression of Izuku's quirk here, on a stage with clear rules and careful oversight, than in some future emergency where the stakes were considerably higher and the narrative considerably harder to control. It was Momo, during a late evening study session in the days that followed, who offered Izuku the framing that finally settled his unease into something closer to resolve. She pointed out, with her usual careful logic, that a quirk built around restraint and precision was, in its own way, the perfect subject for exactly the kind of scrutiny the festival invited, because it would let the public see not simply raw destructive power, which frightened people almost as often as it impressed them, but control, judgment, the deliberate, careful application of enormous capability toward specific, limited ends. That, she said, watching him with the same steady, thoughtful attention she brought to every serious conversation between them, was exactly the kind of hero the public most needed to see more of, especially in the uneasy weeks following a real villain attack on their own school. Izuku carried that thought with him through the final stretch of preparation, through extra training sessions squeezed in around regular coursework, through Recovery Girl's careful monitoring of his stamina thresholds, through Aizawa's increasingly specific drills meant to sharpen the precision of his control rather than simply its raw scale. By the morning the festival finally arrived, dawning bright and clear over the packed stadium already thick with the low roar of an enormous, expectant crowd, Izuku Midoriya stood in the staging tunnel beside his classmates feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something closer to readiness than fear, the strange, hard-won calm of a boy who had spent his entire life learning exactly how much of himself the world could safely be shown, and who had finally decided it was time to show a little more of it. 10. The obstacle race began the moment Midnight's whip cracked through the air above the stadium, 400 first-year students surging forward through the tunnel mouth into a course that Izuku recognized almost immediately as a deliberately merciless gauntlet, the first stretch dominated by a field of massive robots, the same models, scaled up considerably, that he remembered from his own entrance exam months earlier. He did not waste time or stamina destroying them outright the way several of his more aggressive classmates chose to, Bakugo included, whose explosive propulsion sent him blasting straight through a robot's chassis in a spectacular shower of sparks that drew an immediate roar from the crowd. Izuku instead angled toward the narrow gaps between the machines, and where the press of other students threatened to slow him at a genuine bottleneck, he reached briefly for the packed earth beneath his own feet, not to soften it this time but to firm and raise it, just enough, just for a few strides, to grant himself a slight elevation advantage that let him vault clear of the crowd entirely and land running on the far side of the obstacle field. It cost him little, carefully calibrated as it was, and he filed the small success away with quiet satisfaction, exactly the kind of precise, economical use of his ability that Aizawa had spent weeks drilling into him. The second stretch of the course, a wide, uneven expanse of jagged terrain nicknamed the Fall, proved more genuinely dangerous, deep pits and sudden drops scattered without warning across the racing line, and Izuku watched more than one classmate stumble hard into a hidden crevice before he adjusted his own pace, testing the ground ahead of each stride with quick, subtle checks of density that let him avoid the worst of the hazards almost entirely. It was on the final stretch, a narrow bridge spanning a wide chasm with room for only a fraction of the remaining field to cross at once, that Izuku made the choice that would end up on nearly every sports broadcast covering the festival that evening. The bridge itself was solid, unremarkable, but the crush of desperate students fighting for position atop it had turned the crossing into a genuine bottleneck, shoving and jostling threatening to spill more than one competitor over the edge entirely. Izuku, rather than fight for position in the crush, dropped back several strides, planted both feet, and reached for the stone beneath the bridge's near edge, willing a narrow secondary ledge into being, not conjured from nothing. He was careful even in the rush of competition to remember that limit, but drawn from the bridge's own excess mass, thinned and redistributed along its length until a slender, additional walkway extended along its side, just wide enough for a single careful runner to use. He crossed it alone, the crowd's initial confusion at what they were witnessing rapidly curdling into a swell of delighted, disbelieving noise as commentators scrambled to explain exactly what had just happened, and reached the finish line in third place overall, breathing hard, legs trembling with the familiar cost of a use of his quirk larger than anything he had allowed himself to attempt in public before. The cavalry battle that followed forced an entirely different kind of thinking. Teams assembled around a points system tied directly to each competitor's entrance exam and course rankings, and Izuku found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, serving as the anchor of a small four-person team that had assembled around him with a speed that suggested his obstacle course performance had made him considerably more valuable a target and ally than he had anticipated. Ochako joined him without hesitation, her gravity manipulation proving invaluable for evasive maneuvers, alongside a quiet, serious boy from another class whose quirk let him extend and retract sturdy metal cabling perfect for a cavalry formation structural frame, and a third teammate whose speed made her ideal for snatching headbands from unsuspecting opponents. The battle itself was chaos given rules, teams surging and colliding across the open field as they hunted each other's headbands with the particular desperate creativity the situation demanded, and Izuku spent most of it in careful defensive mode, softening the ground beneath aggressive opponents' charging feet to slow their approach, firming it briefly beneath his own team's formation to grant them sudden, precise bursts of stability during evasive turns, husbanding his dwindling stamina with the same discipline his mother had spent a decade instilling in him. It was Bakugo's team, unsurprisingly, that mounted the single most dangerous assault of the entire battle, a full frontal charge aimed directly at stripping Izuku's formation of its own hard-won headband points with an aggression that left no room for subtlety. Izuku met it not with force but with the same principle that had carried him through every crisis so far, precise, minimal intervention rather than overwhelming display, softening a narrow strip of ground directly in Bakugo's charging path at the exact final second, just enough to throw off his footing without genuinely endangering him, buying his own team's rider the split second she needed to twist away and preserve their points intact. Bakugo, sprawled briefly in the dirt before recovering with an explosive burst that carried him clear, shot Izuku a look across the field that was somehow furious and delighted at once, shouting something that got lost in the general roar of the crowd but that Izuku suspected, given the decade of history between them, amounted to a promise that their real reckoning was still coming, later, in whatever bracket the tournament rounds ultimately produced. 11. The bracket, when it was finally posted on the enormous stadium screen, delivered exactly the confrontation Bakugo had promised, Izuku's name slotted directly against his in the tournament's second round. Following an opening match, Izuku won with relative ease against a competitor whose long-range projectile quirk simply could not compensate for terrain that kept shifting, subtly and unpredictably, beneath his feet every time he tried to plant for a clean shot. Izuku spent the break between matches not resting, though Recovery Girl's careful monitoring made clear he badly needed it, but pacing the competitor's tunnel, running through every scrap of data he had ever gathered on Bakugo's fighting style. Years of careful observation from childhood sparring sessions crystallizing now into genuine tactical planning. He knew Bakugo's explosive quirk intimately, its raw destructive ceiling, its dependence on sweat production that meant sustained engagements favored patience over any single overwhelming strike, and he knew, more importantly, that Bakugo would consider anything less than his absolute full effort a genuine insult to a rival he had spent a decade insisting was destined for greatness. The match began the moment Midnight's whip cracked, Bakugo closing the distance almost instantly with a burst of propulsion that filled the arena with the sharp, familiar crack of small controlled explosions, and Izuku, rather than retreat, planted his feet and reached immediately for the ground directly beneath his rival's launching point, softening it just enough to rob the explosion of its full leverage, sending Bakugo's charge subtly off its intended line. It bought him half a second, no more, and Bakugo adjusted with the kind of raw, furious skill that had made him a standout competitor since childhood, correcting his trajectory mid-air and closing the remaining distance anyway, forcing Izuku into a rolling evasion that scraped his shoulder hard against the arena floor. The crowd's noise swelled into something continuous and deafening as the two traded exchanges, Bakugo's explosive strikes forcing Izuku into constant, careful movement, Izuku's own subtle terrain manipulations denying his rival the clean, stable footing his explosive style depended on for maximum effect. It was, both competitors understood without needing to say so, a fight neither of them could win through simple attrition against the other's core strength, and it was Izuku who broke the stalemate first, reaching not for the ground this time but for the dense, humid air itself, thinning a narrow column of it directly around Bakugo's next explosive discharge, robbing the blast of a portion of the oxygen it needed to achieve its full force at the critical instant of ignition. The reduced explosion still staggered him, sent him stumbling half a step, but it was enough of an opening, and Izuku closed the distance himself for the first time in the match, catching Bakugo's overextended arm and using his rival's own momentum, rather than any dramatic display of power, to sweep his legs out from under him and pin him decisively to the arena floor before the review clock had even fully registered the takedown. The stadium fell into a stunned half-second of silence before erupting into noise, and Bakugo, sprawled beneath him breathing hard, stared up at Izuku with an expression that held no trace of the anger Izuku had half-braced for, only a fierce, blazing satisfaction that broke, a moment later, into something almost like a grin. "Knew it," Bakugo muttered, low enough that only Izuku could hear it over the roaring crowd. "Told you years ago you'd be the one to actually push me." Izuku's own tournament run ended 2 matches later, in the semi-final, against a composed, ice quirk user from Class 1A whose sheer raw output overwhelmed Izuku's more careful, precision-based approach in a way brute strength alone had not managed, encasing enough of the arena floor in solid, unyielding ice that Izuku's terrain manipulations found themselves fighting an opponent's power directly rather than the softer, more pliable ground he was accustomed to shaping. He fought hard, and lost cleanly, conceding the match with genuine respect rather than disappointment, understanding, even as he did, that a loss delivered with everything he honestly had was a far more valuable data point, both for his own growth and for the watching professional agencies, than an easy, uncontested win would ever have been. Momo's own tournament run ended in the quarter-final, a narrow, hard-fought loss she took with characteristic grace, and it was Momo, waiting for him in the competitor's tunnel after his own semi-final defeat, who offered the observation that stayed with Izuku longest through the remainder of the festival, that watching him fight had taught her more about genuine strategic thinking than any textbook she had ever studied, and that whatever agency was smart enough to recognize what they had just Watched was going to be very fortunate indeed to have him. 12. The closing ceremony arrived under a sky gone gold and orange with early evening light. The entire first-year class assembled on the field while Midnight worked her way through the final rankings with theatrical relish. Medals presented to a top 3 that placed the Ice Quirk user first, Bakugo a fierce, narrowly contested second, and, to Izuku's genuine surprise, himself in third, a placement that felt, standing there with the weight of a bronze medal settling around his neck, both entirely earned and strangely modest against the scale of everything the day had actually asked of him. The crowd's reaction, when the festival's official broadcast cut briefly to highlight reels of the day's standout moments, told Izuku everything he needed to know about how thoroughly his careful discretion had finally, unavoidably given way to public visibility. Commentators replayed the bridge crossing from the obstacle course again and again, dissecting frame by frame exactly how a first-year student had apparently reshaped solid stone mid-competition, and the analysts' voices carried a mixture of professional fascination and, underneath it, something Izuku recognized immediately as the particular, wary excitement reserved for a genuinely unprecedented quirk. He caught glimpses of his own name trending across social feeds glimpsed on classmates' phones in the tunnel afterward, absolute rewrite becoming, almost overnight, the informal label the public had settled on for whatever it was they had just watched him do, a name Izuku had never actually used himself but that stuck with the particular stubbornness of internet nomenclature regardless. His mother, waiting for him near the family viewing section with tears already standing in her eyes, hugged him so tightly he nearly lost his breath, and told him, in a voice thick with emotion, that she had never been more proud or more terrified in the same single moment of her entire life. The internship offers began arriving before Izuku had even finished changing out of his competition uniform, dozens of them, funneled through the school's official channels according to strict regulation, agencies ranging from small, community-focused practices to some of the largest, most recognizable names in professional hero work, each one accompanied by a formal letter outlining exactly what kind of mentorship and field experience they hoped to offer him. Aizawa, reviewing the stack with him later that evening in an otherwise empty classroom, warned him plainly not to be dazzled by size or fame alone, that the right internship for a quirk like his needed to prioritize careful, controlled development over flashy public exposure, and that Izuku had time, still, to choose thoughtfully rather than simply chasing the loudest name on the list. It was a warm, satisfying kind of exhaustion that carried Izuku back to the dorms that night, the particular tiredness of a day that had asked everything of him and given, in return, something he had not quite realized he needed as badly as he did, genuine, public proof that the power he had spent his entire life learning to fear could also, when wielded with care, be something the world actually welcomed rather than recoiled from. He did not know, walking back across the darkened UA campus with Ochako and Momo chattering easily beside him about the day's highlights, that in a dim, cluttered apartment on the far side of the city, a television still playing highlight footage on mute in the background, a decayed, ancient figure sat motionless in a worn armchair, pale hands folded, watching the replayed image of a teenage boy reshaping solid stone with nothing but focused intention and a look of quiet, exhausted determination. He did not know that the figure's attention, once caught, rarely wandered far from whatever had caught it, or that a raspy, thoughtful voice was already murmuring, to no one in particular, that a quirk capable of rewriting the fundamental properties of reality itself represented something considerably more interesting than the usual crop of promising young heroes the festival tended to produce each year, something worth watching, worth understanding, and, in time, worth acquiring by whatever means eventually proved necessary. Izuku knew none of this. He knew only that he had survived his first true public test, that his classmates had stood beside him rather than apart from him once the truth of his ability came fully into the light, and that somewhere in the weeks and months ahead lay an internship, and further training, and the slow, steady work of becoming the kind of hero All Might himself had once suggested he might be, the one who prevented disasters rather than merely answering them. It was enough, for one night, to walk back to the dorms in the company of friends who had chosen to see his strange, vast power not as something to fear, but as something worth standing beside, and to let tomorrow's uncertainties wait, for a little while longer, in the quiet dark where they belonged. 13. The stack of internship offers on Izuku's desk had grown, by the end of the first week following the sports festival, into something closer to a small mountain of formal letterhead, and Inko, setting a bowl of curry down beside it one evening, remarked with a mixture of amusement and lingering nerves that her son now had more professional suitors than most working adults ever accumulated in an entire career. Izuku laughed at that, though the laugh came out thinner than he intended, because the sheer volume of interest had begun to feel less like an honor and more like a weight he did not entirely know how to carry. He sorted through them methodically over the following days, the same way he had once sorted hero data into his childhood notebooks, setting aside the largest and most famous agencies first, not out of disinterest but out of the same caution Izawa had already warned him to keep close, and turning his attention instead toward offers that spoke less of exposure and prestige and more of mentorship, structure, and the kind of careful, incremental field experience his Quirk genuinely needed. 3 offers in particular kept drawing him back. The first came from Ryukyu, whose agency had built a reputation for methodical, rescue-focused fieldwork and a genuine willingness to train interns in real operational judgment rather than simply parading them for cameras. The second came, somewhat to Izuku's surprise, from Ectoplasm's old friend and fellow former classmate, a lesser-known but deeply respected veteran hero named Gran Torino, whose letter arrived not through official channels but folded inside a plain envelope with a handwritten note that read, in blunt and slightly crooked script, that All Might had personally suggested the boy needed someone willing to push him past his own comfort with restraint, and that Gran Torino happened to specialize in exactly that. The third offer, the one that gave Izuku the most pause, came from an agency he had never heard of before, small, newly formed, led by a hero named Ed Shot whose reputation for precision, discretion, and rescue-focused technique had quietly impressed him during his years of hero research even though the man rarely appeared in flashy news coverage. It was Momo, reviewing the letters spread across the study table between them one evening, who pointed out that Ed Shot's own Quirk, foldable, malleable, capable of compressing his own body into impossibly narrow spaces to reach trapped victims, reflected almost exactly the philosophy Izuku had spent the sports festival demonstrating, power measured not by its raw scale but by the precision of its application. Izawa, when consulted, offered no strong preference among the 3, only the same steady counsel he always gave, that Izuku should choose the mentor most likely to sharpen the specific edges of his control rather than simply flatter his existing strengths. And it was that framing, turned over carefully during a long, quiet walk around the dorm courtyard with Ochako one evening, that finally settled Izuku's decision. He accepted Gran Torino's offer for the coming week's short internship period, reasoning that a hero willing to push him hard and directly, without ceremony or public spectacle, was exactly the kind of foundation he needed before he trusted himself with anything larger. Ochako, walking beside him with her hands tucked into her jacket pockets against the cooling evening air, admitted that she had chosen an agency herself for very different, more practical reasons, a mid-sized rescue-focused firm close enough to home that she could split her stipend between training expenses and the modest financial support she still sent back to her parents whenever she could manage it. She said it plainly, without any trace of self-pity, and Izuku, listening, felt a fresh wave of the quiet, steady respect he had been building for her since the day he pulled her out from beneath a collapsing beam, a respect that had less to do with her Quirk's growing sophistication and more to do with the simple, unglamorous determination she brought to every single thing she did. The press attention, when it finally arrived in full force, did not come through the internship announcements themselves, which UA handled with its usual careful discretion, but through a leaked clip from the sports festival broadcast that had begun circulating widely online, slowed down and analyzed frame by frame by amateur Quirk theorists speculating, with wildly varying degrees of accuracy, about exactly what Izuku's ability actually was and what its practical ceiling might eventually prove to be. Some of the speculation was harmless, even flattering, comparing him favorably to established heroes known for precision and control. Some of it was considerably less comfortable, framing him instead as a potential weapon, a walking contingency the government itself ought to be monitoring more closely than an ordinary hero course student. Izuku tried not to read too much of it, though the habit of compulsive research that had defined his entire childhood made total avoidance nearly impossible, and it was Inko, noticing the tension gathering in her son's shoulders over dinner one night, who finally set down her chopsticks and told him plainly that the opinions of strangers on the internet, however loud, did not get to define who he actually was or what he actually chose to do with his own power. That choice, she reminded him, gently but firmly, had always belonged to him, and to no one else, not the doctors who had once studied him as a child, not the anonymous voices online now speculating about his potential as a weapon, and certainly not to anyone who had never once sat with him through the long, quiet years of learning restraint that had brought him to this exact point. Izuku carried that reminder with him 3 days later as he boarded the train that would take him to Gran Torino's residence for the start of his internship, a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a familiar, restless energy building in his chest, equal parts nerves and anticipation, the particular feeling of standing at the very beginning of something he suspected, correctly as it turned out, was going to change him in ways he could not yet fully predict. 14. Gran Torino's apartment was smaller and considerably messier than Izuku had pictured, cluttered with old newspapers and half-finished cups of tea, and the man himself, when he finally answered the door, looked less like a legendary retired hero and more like someone's cantankerous grandfather interrupted mid-nap. He studied Izuku for a long moment through narrowed eyes, then, without warning, launched a surprisingly fast kick toward Izuku's midsection that Izuku only barely managed to twist away from on pure startled reflex. Good, Gran Torino said, settling back with evident satisfaction as though the ambush had been a perfectly reasonable greeting. All Might told me you had decent instincts. Didn't tell me you'd actually use them the first time an old man tried to kick you in the gut. Most kids just stand there and take it. The days that followed established a rhythm built almost entirely around exactly that kind of unpredictable, physically demanding testing, Gran Torino using his own jet propulsion quirk to close distance at startling speed and force Izuku into constant, reflexive decisions about when his own ability was worth the exhaustion of activating and when ordinary footwork and evasion would serve him better. It was, Izuku came to realize within the first 2 days, a deliberate and remarkably effective lesson in economy, a hard, physical education in the difference between a power that could theoretically solve nearly any problem and the discipline required to solve only the problems that actually needed solving. You keep wanting to fix everything the second it goes wrong, Gran Torino told him bluntly during a break on the second afternoon, both of them sitting on the floor of the cramped apartment while Izuku caught his breath. That's your mother's caution talking, and it's kept you alive this long, so don't think I'm knocking it. But out in the real field, kid, you're not going to have the luxury of pausing to weigh every single choice with a scale that fine. Sometimes you've got half a second, and in half a second, instinct is the only thing fast enough to matter. My job this week isn't to teach you restraint. Your mother already did that better than I ever could. My job is to make sure the instinct underneath the restraint is actually trustworthy. It was a distinction that reframed, almost overnight, the entire way Izuku approached the training, and by the 4th day, when Gran Torino finally deemed him ready for a supervised field patrol through the modest residential district surrounding the apartment, Izuku found himself moving with a fluency he had not quite possessed before, reaching for his quirk not as a last, careful resort weighed against every possible consequence, but as a natural extension of decisions made and trusted in the same instant they were needed. The patrol itself proved unexpectedly eventful. A minor traffic accident, a delivery truck clipping a parked car hard enough to send it rolling toward a small crowd of pedestrians gathered outside a corner shop, gave Izuku exactly the kind of split-second scenario Gran Torino had spent days preparing him for, and rather than freezing to calculate the full, careful scope of an appropriate response, Izuku simply reached, instinctively, for the rolling car's forward momentum, softening the pavement directly in its path just enough to rob it of speed before it reached the crowd, the vehicle grinding to an abrupt, harmless stop a few meters short of where the pedestrians stood frozen in belated alarm. Gran Torino, watching from a rooftop vantage point nearby, said nothing in the immediate aftermath beyond a short, approving grunt, but that evening, back at the apartment, he told Izuku plainly that the response had been exactly right, measured to the actual scale of the danger rather than either overcorrected caution or reckless overreach, and that if Izuku kept trusting his instincts the way he just had, he was going to make an extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily necessary kind of hero, the kind who solved problems so cleanly that most people watching never fully understood how close to disaster they had actually come. The final 2 days of the internship period shifted towards something closer to philosophical conversation than physical drilling, Gran Torino sharing stories from his own decades in the field, including, with visible reluctance, fragments of his history training all might himself as a young man, stories Izuku absorbed with the same rapt, reverent attention he had once reserved for hero trading cards and television broadcasts, except now the man telling them sat directly across from him in a cramped, cluttered living room rather than existing only as a distant, mythologized figure. On the final evening, packing his duffel bag for the train ride home, Izuku asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether Gran Torino had heard any of the speculation circulating online about the true nature and potential danger of his quirk, and whether the old hero shared any of that unease himself. Gran Torino considered the question for a long moment, then told him, with a bluntness that Izuku had come to genuinely appreciate over the course of the week, that every truly powerful quirk in history had drawn exactly that kind of nervous speculation, that fear of power was, in its own strange way, simply the price extraordinary ability always eventually charged, and that the only real answer to it was not to shrink the power down to something smaller and less frightening, but to become, through years of careful, deliberate practice, someone the world could trust to wield it wisely regardless of how large it grew. It was advice Izuku carried with him onto the train home, turning it over alongside everything else the week had taught him, and it was still sitting with him, warm and steady, 3 days later when the first genuine crisis of his young hero career, one that would draw far more attention than any sports festival broadcast ever could, arrived without warning in the middle of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon. 15. The fire started, as most true disasters do, from something almost absurdly small, a faulty wiring junction in the basement of an aging apartment building 3 blocks from the train station where Izuku happened to be walking home from a late study session with Momo, both of them still mid-conversation about a particularly thorny point of hero law when the first thin plume of smoke curled visibly from a third-floor window above them. The building was old enough that its alarm system, Izuku would later learn, had failed silently months earlier without anyone bothering to report it, and by the time the first residents on the lower floors noticed the smell of smoke, the fire had already climbed with the hungry, indifferent speed such old wiring and older insulation tended to produce, cutting off the main stairwell entirely and trapping an unknown number of people somewhere in the floors above. Momo reacted first, already pulling her phone free to alert emergency services while simultaneously assessing the building structure with the same rapid, analytical focus she brought to every serious problem, and Izuku, standing beside her, felt the old, familiar pull of his mother's careful training war briefly against the sharper, more immediate instinct Gran Torino had spent a week honing in him, and it was the instinct, this time, that one. He crossed the street at a dead run before he had fully finished deciding to, reaching the building's front entrance just as a coughing, soot-streaked man stumbled out supporting an elderly woman who could barely stand on her own, and past them, through the open doorway, Izuku could already hear the frantic, muffled sound of someone shouting from somewhere upstairs, trapped behind smoke and heat and a stairwell rapidly becoming impassable. He did not have time for anything as deliberate as his usual careful weighing of cost and consequence. He reached instead for the stairwell itself, willing the scorched, weakening wood of its lower steps into something denser and more stable, buying himself and, crucially, anyone still trying to descend, a structure that would not collapse beneath their combined weight, and began climbing straight into smoke thick enough that within a few steps he could no longer see more than an arm's length ahead of himself. He found them on the second-floor landing, a young mother clutching an infant to her chest, coughing violently, backed into a corner by flames that had already consumed the far end of the hallway and were creeping steadily closer along a path of old, dry carpet. Izuku did not hesitate. He reached for the carpet itself, robbing it of the fuel it needed to keep burning, willing its fibers into something inert and fire-resistant just long enough to open a narrow, survivable path back toward the stairwell, and half-carried, half-guided the coughing, terrified woman and her child down the stabilized steps and out into the smoke-hazed daylight where paramedics, newly arrived, immediately swept them both away for treatment. He went back and twice more before the fire department's ladder trucks finally arrived in force, each trip costing him more than the last, his lungs burning from smoke he had not fully managed to avoid despite his best efforts, his legs growing steadily less steady beneath him, until on the final trip, dragging an unconscious elderly man from a smoke-filled third-floor bedroom, Izuku's vision began to gray dangerously at the edges from a combination of smoke inhalation and the accumulating cost of everything he had already spent that afternoon. It was a professional firefighter, finally making it up the stabilized stairwell in full protective gear, who took the unconscious man from Izuku's failing grip and half-carried, half-shoved him back down toward the entrance, shouting something about students having no business risking themselves like that, even as his tone carried more startled respect than actual anger. Izuku collapsed the moment he cleared the building's front door, and it was Momo, still stationed exactly where he had left her, who caught him before he hit the pavement, lowering him gently down while paramedics converged with an oxygen mask and a barrage of urgent questions about how much smoke he had inhaled. The story broke across national news within hours, a UA Hero Corps student pulling 4 separate residents from a burning building with his bare hands and an ability witnesses could only describe, breathlessly, as somehow controlling the fire and the building itself, footage captured on half a dozen bystander phones circulating within the hour, Izuku's own streaked, exhausted face visible in more than one clip as paramedics loaded him into an ambulance for observation. Aizawa arrived at the hospital before Inko did, having been alerted the moment UA's monitoring systems flagged Izuku's name attached to breaking emergency coverage, and though his expression remained its usual flat, unreadable calm, the tightness in his jaw as he listened to the attending physician's report on smoke inhalation and severe Quirk-related exhaustion told Izuku, even through the haze of his own depleted condition, exactly how close his teacher's composure was to cracking. "You went in 4 times, Aizawa said finally, once the physician had stepped out and left them alone, his voice carrying none of its usual dry detachment. 4 times, kid, on your own, with no backup and no plan beyond wanting to help. Do you understand how easily that could have ended differently?" Izuku, throat still raw from smoke, managed only a small, honest nod, and admitted, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he did understand, that he had known exactly how much risk he was taking with each trip back inside, and that he would, if the exact same afternoon happened again tomorrow, make precisely the same choice regardless. It was not defiance in his voice, only plain, unguarded honesty, and Aizawa, studying him for a long, silent moment, finally allowed himself a small, tired exhale that was not quite approval but was not disapproval either, the complicated, reluctant acknowledgement of a teacher watching a student step, for the first time, fully and irreversibly into the kind of hero he was always going to become. 16. The apartment fire earned Izuku his first genuine taste of national celebrity, a wave of press attention considerably larger and less controllable than anything the sports festival had produced, and the days following his release from the hospital passed in a strange, disorienting blur of official statements, cautious interview requests filtered through UA's public relations office, and an outpouring of public gratitude that arrived in the form of letters, gifts, and messages addressed to the school from residents of the building he had helped evacuate. The elderly man he had carried out on his final, most dangerous trip turned out to be a retired schoolteacher named Hisashi Endo, and it was Endo himself, once sufficiently recovered, who requested a meeting with Izuku through official channels, a request UA approved after careful vetting. The two of them sat together in a quiet visiting room at the hospital, Endo's voice still rough from smoke damage, and the old man told Izuku plainly that he had been entirely certain, lying trapped in that smoke-filled bedroom, that he was going to die there, and that whatever else the wider world eventually decided to make of Izuku's unusual and clearly formidable quirk, he personally would spend whatever years he had left telling anyone who would listen that a boy barely out of his own childhood had walked into fire 4 separate times to make certain a stranger did not die alone. It was a small, private moment, but it settled something in Izuku that the louder, more chaotic public response had not quite managed to reach, a quiet, grounding reminder of exactly why the risk had been worth taking, separate from headlines and viewer numbers and the ongoing, occasionally uncomfortable public debate about whether a quirk as powerful as his belonged in the hands of a teenager at all. That debate found its sharpest expression roughly a week later, when a prominent television commentator, hosting a panel discussion ostensibly about hero regulation, spent nearly 10 minutes questioning aloud whether the Hero Public Safety Commission ought to be monitoring Izuku's development more directly, framing his ability not as a gift but as a potential liability the government had, in the commentator's pointed phrasing, allowed to mature within a school system rather than under proper federal oversight. The segment drew immediate, polarized reaction, defenders pointing to the fire rescue as clear proof of responsible, heroic use, critics insisting that good intentions today offered no guarantee against catastrophic misuse tomorrow, particularly once Izuku graduated beyond UA's careful institutional structure. Nizu addressed the controversy directly in a rare public statement, delivered with the same calm, unbothered precision he brought to everything, noting that UA had, in fact, been coordinating closely with relevant oversight bodies regarding Izuku's development since well before his admission, that his training had been deliberately structured around control and restraint from the very beginning, and that the fire rescue represented, in the school's professional assessment, exactly the outcome that careful, thoughtful cultivation of extraordinary ability was supposed to produce. It was a measured, effective response, and it quieted the loudest of the criticism within a few days, though Izuku noticed, scrolling through coverage late one night despite his mother's repeated gentle suggestions that he simply stop reading it, that the underlying unease never fully disappeared, only receded to a simmer beneath the more prevalent, warmer public admiration. It was Momo who finally convinced him to close his phone entirely one evening, gently pointing out that he had spent nearly 2 hours reading strangers' opinions about a version of himself that existed only in headlines and comment sections, entirely disconnected from the actual person sitting across from her in the dorm common room. "You cannot control what people decide to believe about you from a distance," she told him, with the same calm, deliberate logic she applied to every genuine problem. "You can only control what you actually do, and so far, everything you have actually done has been exactly the kind of thing that ought to make people trust you more, not less. Let the rest of it be noise." It was advice Izuku tried, with mixed success, to internalize over the following weeks, helped considerably by the simple, grounding rhythm of ordinary classwork resuming and his classmates, largely unbothered by the wider public commotion, treating him with the same easy familiarity they always had, Bakugo in particular making a point of loudly, publicly dismissing the television commentary as the ignorant noise of people who had never once stood in a burning building themselves and had no business lecturing anyone who had. What Izuku did not know, and would not learn until considerably later, was that the fire rescue footage, and the accompanying wave of detailed public analysis dissecting exactly how his quirk had functioned under real, uncontrolled crisis conditions, had reached an audience considerably more dangerous and considerably more patient than any outraged television commentator. In a shadowed back room of a rundown bar on the far side of the city, a small gathering of villains watched the same footage on a cracked, second-hand television, and it was the pale, blue-haired young man from the USJ attack, seated closest to the screen with his chin propped against one hand, who finally broke a long silence to observe, in a voice carrying the same clinical detachment Izuku had briefly glimpsed in the ruined plaza months earlier, that whatever plans their organization had been quietly assembling around the boy's quirk needed to accelerate considerably faster than originally intended, because the wider world, it seemed, was rapidly falling in love with exactly the kind of power they had been hoping to keep obscured a while longer. 17. Life at UA settled, in the weeks that followed, into something that almost resembled ordinary routine again, though Izuku noticed small, persistent changes in the texture of his daily life that suggested the fire rescue had shifted something permanently rather than temporarily. Strangers on the street occasionally recognized him now, offering shy waves or quiet words of thanks that always left him faintly flustered. The school's security around student movements grew subtly but noticeably tighter, extra precautions Izawa explained only in the barest, most practical terms as prudent given his rising public profile. And his classmates, while treating him with the same easy warmth as always, had begun, almost without anyone acknowledging it directly, to defer to his read of dangerous situations with a trust that felt both earned and, at times, uncomfortably heavy. It was Tsuyu, blunt and perceptive as always, who named the shift directly during a quiet afternoon study session in the library, observing that Izuku had started to carry himself differently since the fire, not proud exactly, but heavier, as though he were quietly weighing the safety of everyone around him at all times, a habit she gently suggested might exhaust him considerably faster than any single use of his quirk ever could if he did not learn to set it down sometimes. Izuku, turning the observation over with his usual careful seriousness, admitted she was probably right, though knowing that and actually managing to relax the vigilance proved, in practice, considerably harder than simply agreeing with the diagnosis. Ochako took a more direct approach to the problem, dragging him out one Saturday afternoon, over his mild protests about needing to catch up on coursework, to a modest amusement park on the edge of the city, insisting with cheerful, immovable stubbornness that even the most dedicated future hero needed at least one afternoon that had absolutely nothing to do with saving anyone. Momo and Tsuyu joined partway through, and the four of them spent several hours doing nothing more consequential than riding a rickety old roller coaster twice, arguing amiably over the fairness of a rigged ring toss booth, and sharing a single enormous plate of takoyaki that Ochako insisted, with total conviction, was the best in the entire city. It was, Izuku found himself thinking somewhere around the third hour, the first time in nearly 2 months that his mind had gone properly quiet, unburdened by the low, constant hum of vigilance that had settled over him since the fire, and he caught himself laughing, freely and without any particular reason, at something Ochako said about the ring toss booth's obviously bent hoops, and felt, in that small, unremarkable moment, more like an ordinary 16-year-old than he had and longer than he wanted to admit. The mood shifted, briefly, when Momo, watching a nearby street performer manipulate small flames for a delighted crowd of children, asked quietly, without any particular urgency in her voice, whether Izuku had given any real thought to what the television commentators and their oversight concerns might eventually mean for his future once he graduated and started operating independently, outside the protective structure UA currently provided. Izuku considered the question honestly, watching the performers' flames dance and curl obediently under careful control, and admitted that he suspected some form of closer regulatory oversight was probably inevitable once he became a licensed professional, and that he had decided, somewhere in the quiet aftermath of the fire rescue, that he did not actually mind the prospect nearly as much as he once might have, provided the oversight came from people genuinely interested in helping him use his ability well rather than simply containing it out of fear. That's a healthier way to think about it than most people manage, Momo said, with the small, thoughtful smile she reserved for moments when a conversation had genuinely satisfied her, and the topic drifted naturally back toward lighter things as the afternoon wound down into evening, the four of them walking together toward the train station beneath a sky slowly deepening into the soft purples and oranges of early dusk. None of them noticed, in the easy, unguarded warmth of that ordinary Saturday, the quiet, unremarkable man in a plain gray jacket who had been sitting on a bench near the amusement park's main gate for the better part of 2 hours, ostensibly absorbed in a newspaper, his attention drifting periodically, with careful, practiced discretion, toward the small group of laughing students. He made no move to approach them, asked no questions of park staff, drew no attention to himself whatsoever, and by the time Izuku and his friends boarded their train home, he had already folded his newspaper closed and dialed a number on a cheap, prepaid phone, reporting, in a low, unhurried voice, a simple, unremarkable observation, that the target moved with genuine, uncalculated ease among his classmates, trusted them completely, and would, in all likelihood, prove considerably easier to locate and isolate through those same friendships than through any direct approach against a boy who had already demonstrated, quite publicly, exactly how dangerous he could be when cornered. 18. The announcement of the Provisional Hero License exam arrived through Aizawa's characteristically flat delivery during an otherwise unremarkable Monday morning homeroom, a single sentence informing the class that in 3 weeks' time they would sit for the practical and written examination required to legally use their quirks in real field situations without direct adult supervision, followed immediately by his blunt observation that the pass rate hovered, most years, somewhere around the middle of the field, and that Class 1A should not assume its sports festival performance guaranteed anyone an easy path through it. The announcement landed differently across the room depending on each student's temperament, Bakugo greeting it with predictable, aggressive confidence, Ochako with a visible flicker of nerves quickly steadied by determination, Momo with the immediate, methodical calm of someone already mentally cataloging every relevant regulation she would need to review. Izuku felt something closer to quiet, focused readiness, the exam representing, in his mind, less a hurdle to fear and more the next necessary step on a path he had been walking with increasing clarity since the moment Gran Torino first told him that trustworthy instinct, not raw restraint alone, was what ultimately mattered. The 3 weeks of preparation that followed proved some of the most demanding of Izuku's time at UA so far. Aizawa and the other faculty structuring lessons specifically around the exam's known emphasis on realistic, team-based crisis scenarios rather than isolated individual combat, A shift that suited Izuku's own instincts well but forced him to spend considerable additional effort learning to communicate his intentions clearly and quickly to teammates who could not simply read his focus. The way his closest friends had learned to over months of shared training. It was during one such team exercise, paired with Kyoka and Toru in a simulated collapsed building scenario, that Izuku first fully grasped the particular challenge his quirk posed for genuine teamwork, calling out a warning to shift positions half a second before he softened a section of unstable flooring, only to realize, watching Kyoka stumble in confusion at the sudden give beneath her feet, that a warning alone was not the same as a teammate actually understanding, in the moment, exactly what kind of change to expect and how to respond to it. He apologized immediately, and Kyoka, brushing dust from her uniform with more amusement than irritation, told him plainly that the problem was not his quirk but his communication, and suggested, with the same practical directness she brought to most things, that he needed a small, consistent vocabulary, quick words or signals that told teammates exactly what kind of change was coming without requiring a full sentence of explanation in the middle of a crisis. Izuku, turning the suggestion over with immediate, eager focus, spent the following days developing exactly that, a short set of clipped, specific callouts, soft ground, firm path, clear air, each one paired with a simple hand signal, drilling them relentlessly with anyone willing to practice alongside him until the vocabulary became second nature not just to himself but to a growing circle of classmates who found themselves, almost without meaning to, absorbing the shorthand simply from repeated exposure during group study and training sessions. Momo proved an especially enthusiastic collaborator in refining the system, pointing out with her usual analytical precision that a standardized vocabulary like this had genuine value beyond Izuku's own quirk, that any hero team benefited from quick, unambiguous communication protocols, and the two of them spent one particularly long evening in the common room expanding the idea into a broader framework covering several of their classmates' quirks as well. A project that left Izuku, walking back to his own room well past midnight, feeling a satisfaction that had less to do with his own individual growth and more to do with the quiet, growing sense that he was becoming genuinely useful to the people around him in ways that extended well beyond his raw ability. Bakugo, watching one of the group drilling sessions from a slight, characteristic distance with his arms crossed, eventually inserted himself into the practice with the gruff, unspoken insistence of someone who refused to be left out of anything that might sharpen his own combat effectiveness, and it was during one such combined session. Bakugo's explosive propulsion paired unexpectedly well with Izuku's ground manipulation to create a devastating tag team assault pattern against a training dummy array that Aizawa, observing from the sidelines with his usual unreadable expression, finally allowed himself a rare, small nod of approval and remarked, to no one in particular, that Class 1A's cohesion had developed considerably faster than most years he could remember. By the time the exam date finally arrived, dawning gray and overcast over the specialized testing facility on the outskirts of the city, Izuku felt none of the anxious uncertainty that had gripped him before the entrance exam months earlier, replaced instead by the steady, grounded confidence of someone who understood not just his own capabilities but the specific, practiced ways he now knew how to weave those capabilities together with the people standing beside him, a confidence that would be tested, within the first hour of the exam itself, far more severely than any of them had actually anticipated. 19. The provisional license exam's practical portion divided candidates from multiple schools into small, mixed teams deliberately assembled from students who had never trained together before, a structural choice the proctors explained plainly was meant to test genuine adaptability rather than rehearsed familiarity, and Izuku found himself paired with two unfamiliar faces, a broad-shouldered young man from a smaller regional hero school whose quirk let him generate short bursts of magnetic force, and a quiet, watchful girl whose quirk allowed her to briefly project illusory duplicates of herself, both of them regarding Izuku with the faintly wary curiosity of strangers who clearly recognized his face from recent news coverage and were not entirely certain what to expect from him in practice. The scenario itself, once the exam properly began, simulated a chemical spill in a dense urban environment, actors playing panicked civilians scattered throughout a mock city block, genuine hazards marked by warning signage and automated sensors that would flag any team failing to maintain appropriate safety protocols, and Izuku, falling naturally into the coordinating role his UA training had increasingly prepared him for, quickly laid out a simple, clear plan built around his new communication shorthand, softened terrain to slow the simulated spill's spread, firm platforms to create safe evacuation paths, his magnetic teammate handling debris clearance while the illusion user drew scattered civilians toward extraction points using convincing duplicate images of rescue personnel. The plan worked well for the first several minutes, the three of them falling into an efficient, if slightly unpolished, rhythm that earned a visible nod of approval from the proctor monitoring their section. But the scenario's true difficulty revealed itself when a secondary, unscripted complication triggered partway through. A simulated structural failure in a nearby building that sent debris crashing down directly into their evacuation path, injuring one of the actor civilians badly enough that the exam's medical simulation flagged the injury as requiring immediate, careful stabilization before any further movement could occur safely. It was exactly the kind of layered, cascading crisis real field work regularly produced, and Izuku felt the old, familiar pull of instinct and careful calculation warring briefly inside him before resolving, cleanly now, into the trustworthy synthesis Gran Torino had spent a week teaching him to trust. He called out his shorthand warning, firm path, directing his magnetic teammate to redirect his attention toward stabilizing the falling debris rather than continuing debris clearance elsewhere, while Izuku himself knelt beside the injured actor and reached, carefully and precisely, for the packed rubble pinning the man's leg, softening only the narrow section directly trapping him rather than risking a larger, more destabilizing alteration to the surrounding wreckage. The illusion user, watching the improvised adjustment unfold with visible surprise, adapted quickly of her own accord, projecting a duplicate image of herself further down the evacuation path to draw the attention of remaining panicked civilians away from the collapse zone entirely, buying the real team the clear space they needed to finish stabilizing the injured actor and complete the evacuation without further complication. And by the time the scenario's timer finally expired, all three of them breathing hard but genuinely, unmistakably successful, the proctor's tablet had already logged a passing evaluation across every category the exam measured. The written portion that followed the practical exam felt almost anticlimactic by comparison, a straightforward test of legal knowledge and crisis protocol that Izuku's years of obsessive hero research had more than adequately prepared him for, and he walked out of the testing facility that afternoon with the quiet, settled certainty of someone who had genuinely earned whatever result the exam eventually produced, rather than the anxious uncertainty that had gripped him before the entrance exam. Months earlier. The results, delivered by mail 3 days later in the compact, official envelope every examinee dreaded and anticipated in equal measure, confirmed what Izuku had already suspected. He had passed, cleanly and without any flagged concerns, and so, he learned over the following days through a flurry of excited group messages, had nearly the entire rest of Class 1A, a success rate high enough that even Aizawa, delivering the news during homeroom with his usual dry understatement, allowed himself a rare, small compliment, observing only that the class had clearly done something right in its preparation and that he expected the same standard, if not higher, going forward. The celebration that evening, an impromptu gathering in the dorm's common room that somehow expanded, within an hour, into nearly the entire class crowded around a modest spread of snacks Momo had insisted on properly organizing rather than leaving to chance, carried a warmth and easy camaraderie that Izuku found himself simply, quietly enjoying rather than analyzing, content for once to exist in the moment without turning it into another lesson to catalog for later. It was Ochako, catching him during a rare lull in the noise, who leaned against the wall beside him and observed, with a small, satisfied smile, that they had all come a long way from a group of strangers nervously introducing themselves on the first day of term, and Izuku, looking around the crowded, laughing room, found he genuinely could not disagree, though he had no way yet of knowing that the greatest test of exactly how far that bond could hold was still waiting for them, only a few weeks further down the road, in the quiet, isolated mountains where UA's upcoming summer training camp had already been scheduled to take place. 20. The bus ride into the mountains took nearly 3 hours, winding roads climbing steadily higher through dense forest until the city fell away entirely behind them, replaced by the kind of deep, unbroken green that made more than one classmate press their face against the window in open delight. The summer training camp, hosted by the Wild Pussycats at their remote mountain facility, promised a full week of intensive quirk development exercises designed specifically around each student's individual growth needs, a level of personalized attention UA's regular curriculum could not always provide amid the demands of a full class schedule. Mandalay, the team's telepathic leader, greeted them at the facility gates with brisk, welcoming energy, explaining that the surrounding forest had been specifically selected for its varied, challenging terrain, dense woodland, rocky outcroppings, a wide, fast-moving river, precisely the kind of unpredictable natural obstacles that let each student push against the genuine limits of their ability rather than the artificially controlled conditions of a standard training facility. Izuku, listening with his usual eager attention, felt a familiar flicker of anticipation at the prospect, his mind already turning over the specific ways such varied terrain might sharpen the precision his quirk depended on. The first 2 days settled into a demanding but genuinely productive rhythm, students rotating through a series of individualized challenges under the direct, careful supervision of the Pussycats team, each hero offering targeted feedback drawn from years of real field experience. Izuku's own sessions focused heavily on scale and speed, Pixie Bob pushing him repeatedly to identify, under increasing time pressure, the absolute minimum alteration necessary to solve a given obstacle, a discipline that left him mentally exhausted in a way distinctly different from the physical exhaustion his quirk usually produced, but that he recognized, even through the fatigue, as exactly the kind of refinement his ability still genuinely needed. Evenings brought a welcome, looser kind of camaraderie, the entire class gathered around a modest campfire trading stories and good-natured complaints about the day's training, Mina leading an increasingly elaborate series of camp games that even the more reserved members of the class, Tsuyu included, found themselves reluctantly drawn into. It was during one such evening, the fire crackling low and the surrounding forest settling into the particular hush that only true wilderness darkness produced, that Momo sat down beside Izuku with 2 cups of tea and asked, in the quiet, direct way she reserved for genuinely important questions, whether he had given any further thought to what kind of hero he actually wanted to become, beyond the increasingly public reputation the Fire Rescue and Sports Festival had already built for him. Izuku considered the question with real seriousness, watching the fire's low flames for a long moment before answering that he thought, more and more, that he wanted to be the kind of hero who arrived before the disaster fully happened rather than after, the one who noticed the crack in the foundation before the building came down, who could buy the world the extra few seconds it usually never had. Momo listened without interrupting, and when he finished, told him quietly that she thought that was already exactly who he was becoming, and that watching it happen, gradually, over the months since they had first met in that same classroom on the first day of term, had taught her more about the actual meaning of heroism than any single lecture in their academic curriculum ever had. It was a small, warm exchange, the kind that might have passed entirely unremarked in the ordinary rhythm of camp life, but Izuku found himself returning to it later that night, lying awake in the boys' dormitory cabin listening to the soft, steady breathing of classmates already asleep around him, turning over the strange, quiet satisfaction of having found, in this unlikely collection of extraordinary, ordinary teenagers, something that felt increasingly, unmistakably like the kind of belonging his younger self, isolated by a secret too large to share, had never quite let himself imagine. He did not know, drifting finally toward sleep with the forest's night sound settling around the cabin, that nearly 200 kilometers away, in a cramped, dimly lit apartment thick with the smell of old paper and stale tea, a decayed, ancient figure had spent the entire evening reviewing satellite imagery of the exact mountain facility where Izuku now slept, tracing with one withered finger the isolated access roads and thin communications infrastructure that made the location, for a certain kind of patient, opportunistic predator, considerably more vulnerable than its scenic remoteness might otherwise suggest. He did not know that the same pale, blue-haired young man from the USJ attack was, at that exact moment, seated across a cluttered table from that decayed figure, listening with quiet, focused attention as plans were laid, adjusted, and finalized for an operation that had been patiently building since the moment the League first watched footage of Izuku reshaping solid stone on national television. An operation timed with deliberate, careful precision to strike not at a crowded, defended stadium or a bustling city street, but at exactly the kind of remote, isolated location where a school's careful protective structures would, for the first time since Izuku's arrival at UA, prove considerably thinner than anyone watching from the mountain cabin's peaceful darkness could yet imagine. 21. The fourth day of training camp introduced what Mandalay described, with a note of genuine relish, as the facility's signature exercise, a full-scale survival simulation that would see the class divided into small teams and released into the deep forest with only basic supplies, tasked with reaching a marked extraction point on the far side of the mountain before nightfall, while the Pussycats team, along with several of UA's own faculty who had traveled up separately to observe, tracked their progress and occasionally introduced controlled complications along the route. Izuku found himself grouped with Bakugo, Kirishima, and Tsuyu, a combination that produced, within the first hour, a surprisingly effective if occasionally loud dynamic. Bakugo's raw impatience with anything resembling careful deliberation balanced by Kirishima's steady, good-natured willingness to mediate and Tsuyu's calm, practical observations keeping the group's pace grounded and efficient. Izuku, drawing on the coordinating role he had grown increasingly comfortable with since the license exam, found himself directing the group's route selection with quiet confidence, using brief, careful applications of his quirk to test unstable footing along steep sections of trail before anyone committed their full weight to a crossing. It was midway through the afternoon, the group pausing to rest beside a narrow, fast-moving stream, that Bakugo, uncharacteristically, brought up the subject of the fire rescue directly, asking bluntly whether Izuku had actually been scared, in the moment, walking back into a burning building for the fourth time with his own body already failing under the strain. Izuku considered the question honestly, aware that Bakugo rarely asked things without genuinely wanting the real answer rather than a comfortable one, and admitted that he had been terrified, that fear had been present through nearly the entire ordeal, but that the fear had simply never once outweighed the plainer, more urgent fact that people were still trapped inside and he was the only one positioned to reach them in time. "That's the difference between you and half the pros out there," Bakugo said, with none of his usual mocking edge, just flat, considered honesty. "Most of them wait until the fear goes away before they move. You never have. Don't know if that's brave or just reckless, but it's why everyone in our class trusts you the way they do, whether you've noticed it or not." Izuku had noticed it, in fragments and small moments accumulated over months, but hearing it stated so plainly by Bakugo of all people settled something in him that felt, in its own quiet way, as significant as anything Gran Torino or Momo had told him. Tsuyu, listening from a few feet away, added her own observation with characteristic directness, that trust like that came with real weight attached, and that Izuku owed it to all of them, not just himself, to keep taking care of his own limits as seriously as he took care of everyone else's, a sentiment Kirishima echoed with an enthusiastic nod that made the whole exchange, however serious its core, end on a note of genuine warmth rather than lecture. The group reached the extraction point with nearly an hour to spare, one of the first teams to arrive, and spent the remaining daylight helping Mandalay coordinate the arrival of the other, more scattered groups, Izuku's practiced eye for terrain proving genuinely useful in identifying the safest paths for teams navigating the mountain's more treacherous eastern slope as evening light began to fade toward dusk. That night's camp gathering carried a different, more subdued energy than previous evenings, the physical exhaustion of a full day's trek settling heavily over the entire class, and most students drifted off toward their cabins earlier than usual, leaving only a small handful still awake around the dying fire when Aizawa, who had traveled up that afternoon for a scheduled check-in with the Pussycats team, took a seat nearby and studied the remaining stragglers with his usual flat, assessing gaze. He said little of substance that evening, mostly confirming logistics for the training camp's remaining days, but Izuku noticed, watching his teacher's posture more carefully than perhaps anyone else in the class thought to, a faint, uncharacteristic tension in the set of Aizawa's shoulders, the kind of coiled alertness Izuku had only ever seen from him once before, in the moments immediately preceding the USJ attack. When Izuku finally worked up the nerve to ask, quietly, whether everything was actually alright, Aizawa's answer came measured and careful, that recent intelligence had flagged some increased chatter regarding potential threats to isolated training locations, nothing confirmed or specific enough to warrant canceling the camp outright, but enough that faculty presence had been quietly reinforced for the remainder of the week as a simple, sensible precaution. It was not, strictly speaking, a reassuring answer, and Izuku carried a faint, unsettled undercurrent of it with him back to the boys' cabin that night, lying awake longer than his exhausted body strictly wanted to allow, listening to the deep, unbroken quiet of the surrounding forest and wondering, with the same restless, analytical instinct that had once filled 100 childhood notebooks. Exactly what kind of threat could possibly be significant enough to visibly unsettle a man as consistently unflappable as Shota Aizawa? 22. The attack came on the fifth night, well past midnight, in the deep, absolute darkness that settled over the mountain facility once the last of the camp's low lighting had been dimmed for the evening, and the first sign anything was wrong was not an alarm or a shout but a sudden, total silence, the forest's usual chorus of insects and night birds cutting off all at once as though the entire mountainside had, in the same instant, drawn a sharp, collective breath. Izuku woke to Kurishima's hand shaking his shoulder, low, urgent whispers cutting through the last fog of sleep, "Something's wrong outside," and by the time he had pulled on his shoes and stepped out of the cabin, the first real confirmation arrived in the form of Mandalay's telepathic voice cutting directly into every student's mind at once, sharp and controlled despite the obvious strain beneath it, instructing every single student to move immediately toward the designated emergency rally point and to avoid, under any circumstances, engaging directly with whatever had triggered the facility's outer perimeter alarms. The rally point, when Izuku and a handful of scrambling classmates reached it, was already chaos, faculty and Pussycat's team members converging with grim, focused urgency while students clustered in frightened, half-dressed knots trying to make sense of fragmented, contradictory information. It was Aizawa's voice, cutting through the noise with characteristic bluntness, that finally delivered the confirmation Izuku had half feared since the previous night's unsettled conversation by the campfire, that the facility's perimeter had been breached by a coordinated group matching known League of Villains operatives, and that the primary objective, based on the pattern of the intrusion, appeared to be a deliberate, targeted attempt to isolate and capture a specific student rather than a broader, indiscriminate assault. Izuku did not need to ask which student. The sudden, weighted silence that followed Aizawa's announcement, and the way several nearby faculty members' eyes flicked briefly, involuntarily toward him, told him everything the words themselves had carefully avoided stating outright. His stomach dropped with a cold, familiar dread, not for himself exactly, but for the immediate, obvious danger his presence now represented to every single classmate standing near him in the darkness. The confirmation arrived less than a minute later in the worst possible form, a sudden, violent eruption of black, swirling mist tearing open directly at the edge of the rally point's gathered crowd, and through it stepped the same pale, blue-haired young man from the USJ attack, his expression carrying none of the detached curiosity Izuku remembered from their first encounter, replaced now with a focused, almost hungry intensity that fixed immediately and unmistakably on Izuku alone. "There you are," the young man said, and the mist around him surged forward with sudden, coordinated purpose, separating Izuku bodily from the cluster of classmates and faculty around him in the same violent instant that Kurishima lunged forward with a shout, hardened fists swinging toward the encroaching darkness, only to pass through empty, dissolving mist that reformed a heartbeat later several meters away, Izuku already pulled halfway into its churning black depths. The last thing Izuku heard before the mist closed fully around him was Ochako's voice, raw and desperate, screaming his name into the chaos, and then the world dissolved into disorienting, weightless darkness, the sensation of being pulled somewhere he had no ability to resist or navigate, until it deposited him, abruptly and without ceremony, onto the cold, damp floor of a small forest clearing he did not recognize, lit only by the pale, indifferent glow of the moon overhead. He was not alone. The blue-haired young man stood a short distance away, arms loosely crossed, and beside him, seated on a fallen log with the unhurried patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment, was a figure whose appearance struck Izuku with an immediate, visceral wrongness he could not fully name, a tall, gaunt shape wrapped in layers of dark, patched cloth, hands folded, and a face, when it finally turned toward him beneath the hood's shadow, that seemed less like flesh than like something aged and preserved far past any natural human span, patched together from mismatched pieces held in place by will alone. "Izuku Midoriya," the figure said, and the voice carried a raspy, unhurried quality that seemed to promise, beneath its calm, that whatever happened in this clearing over the next several minutes had already been decided long before Izuku ever arrived. "I have watched your footage with considerable interest, young man. A quirk capable of rewriting reality itself. Do you have any idea, I wonder, how vanishingly rare a gift like yours actually is, or how badly certain people in this world would do almost anything at all to make sure it did not simply go to waste in the hands of someone determined to squander it protecting a society that has never once deserved the sacrifice. Izuku, every instinct in his body screaming danger louder than it ever had in his entire life, took a single, careful step backward, and felt, for the first time since he was very small, the full, crushing weight of exactly how alone he currently was. 23. Izuku's mind raced through every scrap of hero theory and villain analysis he had ever catalogued, searching desperately for some frame of reference that could make sense of the figure seated calmly before him, and finding, unsettlingly, nothing that quite fit. This was not the raw, chaotic menace of an ordinary villain, nor even the calculated, clinical danger he had sensed from the blue-haired young man during the USJ attack. This was something older, patient in a way that felt almost geological, a presence that regarded the entire structure of hero society, Izuku included, as a minor, temporary inconvenience rather than any genuine obstacle. You have 3 choices in front of you tonight, the figure continued, unbothered by Izuku's silence, though I suspect you will only recognize 2 of them as choices at all. You could come with us willingly, and I promise you, whatever your imagination is currently supplying, that the offer is genuine. A power like yours, properly cultivated without the constant, suffocating restraint your mother instilled in you from childhood, could reshape considerably more than burning buildings and collapsing bridges. You could fight, though I think even you understand, standing here alone against the 2 of us in the dark, exactly how that particular choice is likely to end. Or you could simply stall, buying time for rescue you are not entirely certain is even coming, which I will admit is probably the wisest of your 3 available options, though I doubt it changes tonight's ultimate outcome by very much. Izuku said nothing, his mind working furiously beneath the outward stillness he forced himself to maintain, cataloging the clearing's terrain, the distance to the tree-line, the blue-haired young man's relaxed but ready stance, searching for any advantage his exhausted, adrenaline-flooded thinking could actually locate. He settled, finally, on the only genuine leverage he possessed, the same principle that had carried him through every crisis since childhood, that his power responded most reliably not to raw desire but to clear, specific necessity, and that necessity, standing in this clearing, was singular and absolute. He needed time, and he needed the ground beneath his captors to become considerably less trustworthy than it currently was. He moved before he had fully finished the thought, dropping low and slamming both palms flat against the damp earth, willing the ground directly beneath the blue-haired young man's feet into something loose and shifting exactly as it had at the USJ, and for one precious, chaotic second it worked, the young man's balance faltering, mist billowing outward in startled, defensive reflex rather than coordinated attack. Izuku used the opening to scramble backward toward the tree-line, reaching simultaneously for the packed earth behind him, firming it into a raised, uneven barrier that bought a few more critical seconds of separation. The god figure on the log did not move at all, watching the brief scramble with an expression that carried, unmistakably, something closer to genuine amusement than alarm. Good instincts, he observed, almost conversationally, as the blue-haired young man recovered his footing with a scowl and advanced again, more carefully this time. Precisely the kind of instinct that would flourish under proper guidance rather than the timid half-measures you have been permitted so far. It really would be such a waste to simply break you here in these woods when there is so much more you could become. Izuku did not answer, could not spare the breath to answer, every remaining scrap of concentration bent toward staying alive and buying time, softening ground, hardening barriers, each alteration smaller and more desperate than the last as his exhausted body began, inevitably, to fail him, his vision swimming, his legs trembling beneath him in a way that had nothing left to do with courage and everything to do with simple, biological limit. He was losing, and some clear, cold part of his mind understood it plainly even as the rest of him kept fighting anyway, because stopping was not a choice his mother's decade of quiet, careful training had ever actually left available to him. It was the sudden, thunderous crack of an explosion tearing through the tree-line behind him, followed immediately by Bakugo's furious, familiar voice roaring his name, that finally broke the desperate rhythm of the fight, Bakugo bursting into the clearing with both palms already crackling, Kirishima close behind him with his skin fully hardened, and behind them both, moving with the terrifying, coiled speed Izuku had once watched only on grainy training footage, Aizawa himself, goggles down. capture weapon already unwinding through the air toward the blue-haired young man's exposed shoulder. The gaunt figure rose from the fallen log at last, unhurried even as the clearing filled suddenly with noise and violence, and regarded the arriving reinforcements with the same distant, patient amusement he had shown Izuku throughout the entire encounter. "Another time, then," he said, to no one in particular, and the darkness around him seemed, impossibly, to thicken and swallow his shape whole even as Aizawa's capture weapon closed uselessly around empty air where he had been standing only a heartbeat before, leaving behind only the blue-haired young man, snarling and outnumbered, and the cold, sinking certainty, settling deep in Izuku's exhausted chest, that whatever he had just glimpsed in that gaunt figure's patient, hungry attention was very far from finished with him. 24. The blue-haired young man did not stay to fight a losing battle. He retreated into a final burst of mist the instant Aizawa's capture weapon missed its mark, vanishing from the clearing with a parting glance at Izuku that carried none of the gaunt figure's patient amusement, only a flat, promising kind of anger, and then the clearing was suddenly, disorientingly quiet again, filled only with the ragged sound of everyone's breathing and the distant, receding noise of continued fighting still echoing from deeper in the forest where the rest of the League's coordinated assault was, Izuku would later learn, being methodically repelled by the combined efforts of Yui's faculty and the Pussycats team. Izuku's legs finally gave out the moment the immediate danger passed, and it was Bakugo, reaching him first, who caught him under the arms before he hit the ground, lowering him down with a roughness that could not entirely disguise the genuine fear still evident in his tight, controlled expression. "You absolute idiot," Bakugo muttered, crouching beside him, voice low and furious in a way that Izuku understood, even through his exhaustion, was not really anger at all. "Getting snatched right out from under everyone like that. Do you have any idea what it looked like, watching that mist swallow you up?" Kirishima, kneeling on Izuku's other side, offered a quieter, steadier kind of reassurance, checking him over for injury with careful, practiced hands while Aizawa, standing guard at the clearing's edge with his capture weapon still coiled and ready, spoke in low, urgent tones into a communicator, relaying Izuku's location and condition to the rest of the response team scattered through the forest. It was several more minutes before the clearing filled properly with reinforcements, Mandalay arriving first with visible, palpable relief, followed shortly by a wider group that included, to Izuku's dizzy, exhausted surprise, nearly the entire rest of his class, having refused, apparently, to remain safely at the rally point once word spread that Izuku had been taken. The retreat back to the main facility passed in a blur for Izuku, half carried between Bakugo and Kirishima, the forest around them gradually settling back into its usual quiet as the last of the League's forces withdrew under the combined pressure of Yui's faculty response. It was not until he was finally seated safely inside the facility's main lodge, a blanket draped over his shoulders and recovery girl, who had traveled up as part of the reinforced faculty presence, already beginning a careful assessment of his condition, that the full scale of what had actually happened began to properly settle over him. Ochako reached him moments later, pushing through the crowded lodge with an urgency that scattered lesser obstacles out of her path entirely, and the moment she reached him she wrapped both arms around him so tightly it nearly hurt, her voice cracking as she told him, half scolding and half simply relieved beyond words, that she had never in her life been so frightened as the moment that mist closed around him and pulled him out of sight. Izuku, too exhausted to do much beyond return the embrace weakly, told her, honestly, that he had been frightened too, more frightened than the fire, more frightened than the USJ, because this time, for the first time, the danger had been aimed directly and specifically at him rather than simply crossing his path. The full accounting of the night's events took shape gradually over the following hours, faculty conferring in low, urgent voices while students, too keyed up on adrenaline to sleep, gathered in tight, quiet clusters trading fragments of what each of them had witnessed. No student had suffered serious injury, a fact that struck Izuku, turning it over in his exhausted mind, as remarkable given the scale and clear coordination of the attack, a testament, Aizawa noted grimly during a brief address to the assembled class near dawn, to exactly how much faster and more effectively they had all responded compared to the chaos of the USJ months earlier. It was Aizawa, pulling Izuku aside privately once the worst of the immediate crisis had passed, who finally gave voice to the question sitting heaviest in Izuku's own exhausted mind, asking carefully, without any trace of accusation, exactly what the gaunt figure in the clearing had said to him, and what, if anything, about his manner or appearance had struck Izuku as significant. Izuku recounted it as precisely as his rattled memory allowed: the offer, the patient amusement, the unsettling, almost geological sense of age and authority the figure had carried despite never once raising his voice or making any overtly threatening move. Aizawa listened in grim, focused silence, and when Izuku finished, told him plainly, in a voice stripped of its usual dry detachment, that the description matched, closely enough to leave little real doubt, intelligence the Hero Public Safety Commission had been quietly circulating for years regarding a figure believed responsible for supplying and coordinating villain activity at the highest, most dangerous levels imaginable, a shadow presence Hero Society had never managed to confirm, capture, or even properly name, referred to in classified briefings only by a designation that, spoken aloud in the quiet, exhausted stillness of the lodge, settled over Izuku with a weight considerably heavier than anything the night's physical danger had managed to produce, all for one, and the plain, sobering understanding, delivered without softening by his teacher's steady, unflinching gaze, that whatever had just happened in that isolated mountain clearing was not an ending, but only the very first, deliberate opening move of something considerably larger than any of them, Izuku included, had yet fully understood. 25. The remaining 2 days of training camp were cancelled outright, the entire class transported back to the city under heavy security the following morning, and the drive back down the mountain passed in a subdued, watchful quiet entirely unlike the excited chatter that had filled the same road less than a week earlier. Izuku spent most of the ride staring out the window at the passing forest, turning the name Aizawa had given him over and over in his mind, all for one, searching his own extensive mental catalogue of hero history and villain analysis for any prior reference and finding, unsettlingly, almost nothing concrete, only rumor, speculation, and the occasional oblique reference buried in older news archives to an entity some retired heroes insisted had shaped the entire underworld of organized villainy for decades without ever once stepping fully into public view. Nizu called a private meeting the moment the bus arrived back at UA. Izuku, Inko, Aizawa, and a representative from the Hero Public Safety Commission gathered around the same conference table where Izuku had first discussed his quirk with the school's faculty nearly a year earlier. The commission representative, a composed, precise woman who introduced herself only as Director Tsuragi, laid out the situation with careful, measured honesty, confirming that the description Izuku provided matched profile elements the commission had been quietly compiling for years, that the individual in question was believed to possess a quirk capable of transferring and stacking other quirks onto himself or onto chosen subordinates, and that his apparent, direct interest in Izuku's own ability represented a genuine, serious escalation the commission intended to take with the utmost seriousness going forward. Inko, sitting rigid beside her son throughout the entire briefing, finally spoke up partway through, her voice steady despite the visible strain beneath it, asking bluntly what practical protection the commission actually intended to provide, given that a supposedly secure, isolated training facility had proven, in the end, considerably less safe than anyone had promised her when Izuku first left for the mountains. Director Tsuragi did not flinch from the question, acknowledging plainly that security protocols for events involving Izuku would need substantial revision going forward, additional faculty presence, tighter control over publicly available information regarding his schedule and movements, and closer coordination between UA and Commission resources whenever Izuku participated in any activity outside the school's own secured campus. It was Nizu, listening quietly through most of the exchange with his usual small, attentive stillness, who finally offered the observation that settled the room's tension into something closer to workable resolution, pointing out that the goal of these new measures could not reasonably be to seal Izuku away from the world entirely, since doing so would both fail his development as a hero and, more importantly, hand a considerable victory to exactly the kind of fear-based thinking is growing public profile had already been fighting against for months. The goal, Nizu suggested, ought instead to be careful, intelligent balance, real security without genuine isolation, and he pledged, with the calm, unshakable confidence that had made him principal of the country's most respected hero school, that UA intended to provide exactly that. Izuku, listening to the adults around him negotiate the shape of his own continued safety, found himself less afraid, in that moment, than he might have expected, replaced instead by a quiet, hardening resolve that had been building steadily since the clearing, since the god figure's patient, unsettling offer, since the plain understanding that fleeing from what he could do had never once been a real option available to him. He spoke up finally, interrupting the adult's careful planning with a directness that surprised even himself, and told the room plainly that he did not want to be protected into uselessness, that he understood the danger now in a way he had not fully grasped before that night in the clearing, but that hiding from it would only mean the people he cared about, his classmates, his mother, strangers he had not yet had the chance to help, remained exposed to exactly the kind of danger he was, in fact, uniquely positioned to eventually help stop. It was a bold thing to say to a room full of adults responsible for his safety, and Izuku half expected pushback, but what he found instead, studying the faces around the table, was something closer to careful, considering respect, Aizawa's small, approving nod chief among them, and Director Tsurugi's own measured acknowledgement that the commission's job was to manage risk intelligently, not to eliminate a hero's willingness to actually be one. The meeting ended without any final, dramatic resolution, only the practical, unglamorous work of adjusted protocols and increased coordination that would define the shape of Izuku's continued training over the following months. But Izuku walked out of that conference room feeling, for the first time since the mist first closed around him in that dark forest clearing, something closer to clarity than fear, a settled, hard-won understanding that the encounter with All for One had not broken anything essential in him, only sharpened, considerably, exactly how seriously he needed to take the road still stretching out ahead. 26. The class returned to something resembling normal routine within a week, though normal now carried a different, more watchful texture than it had before the training camp, extra faculty presence quietly woven into the school's daily rhythm, subtle adjustments to student movement protocols that most of Class 1A accepted without complaint once Aizawa explained, plainly and without unnecessary alarm, exactly why the changes had become necessary. The wider public, kept deliberately unaware of the specific details surrounding the attack's true target and the identity of the figure behind it, received only a carefully worded official statement describing an attempted intrusion successfully repelled by faculty and student cooperation, a version of events accurate enough to satisfy scrutiny without revealing the considerably more dangerous truth underneath it. Within the class itself, though, the truth could not remain fully contained, and Izuku found himself, in the days following their return, the recipient of a quiet, steady stream of concern and support from classmates who had, each in their own way, been shaken by watching him pulled bodily out of their midst by an enemy none of them had been prepared to face. Momo sought him out during a free period to ask, with characteristic directness, whether he wanted to talk through the encounter analytically, cataloging what had worked and what had not in his improvised defense, a conversation Izuku found unexpectedly steadying, the familiar rhythm of careful analysis giving shape to an experience that had otherwise threatened to remain a formless, unprocessed knot of fear. Tsuyu, for her part, offered a quieter, more observational kind of support, simply making a point of sitting near him during meals and study sessions without demanding conversation, a steady, undemanding presence that Izuku came to appreciate more than he initially expected. Bakugo said little more about the encounter directly after that first, raw exchange in the forest clearing, but Izuku noticed, over the following days, a new, deliberate consistency to his training partner assignments, Bakugo maneuvering, without ever explicitly announcing it, to be paired with Izuku considerably more often than random assignment alone would have produced, a silent, characteristic declaration of intent that needed no further explanation between two people who had known each other since childhood. It was Ochako who addressed the emotional core of the experience most directly, cornering him one evening in the dorm's quiet study room and asking, without preamble, whether he was actually, honestly doing all right, rather than simply performing the steady composure he had been carefully maintaining in front of the wider class. Izuku, caught by the directness of the question, found himself admitting, for the first time since the clearing, the fuller shape of what still sat unresolved in him, not just fear of the encounter itself, but a colder, more persistent unease at how easily, how casually, the god figure had spoken of him as something to be acquired rather than a person to be reasoned with. An object of considerable value rather than a boy of 16 making his own choices about his own life. Ochako listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, told him plainly that the fact such treatment had unsettled him so deeply was, in her assessment, exactly the proof that he remained precisely the kind of person that figure could never actually understand or successfully claim, because everything valuable about who Izuku was, his restraint, his care, his stubborn insistence on protecting people rather than simply overpowering them, existed specifically because he had never once let himself be reduced to nothing more than the raw scale of his own ability. "That's the whole thing he's wrong about," she said, with quiet, fierce conviction. "He sees a weapon. The rest of us have always seen you." It was, Izuku thought later, lying awake that night turning the conversation over with the same careful attention he gave everything that mattered to him, exactly the kind of clarity he had needed without fully realizing he was searching for it, and he found himself, in the days that followed, settling gradually back into the steady, purposeful rhythm of his training and his friendships with a resilience that surprised even him, the fear of that dark clearing folding itself, slowly, into simple, hardened resolve rather than lingering, corrosive dread. He did not yet know exactly what shape the coming months would take, whether All for One's patient interest would resurface soon or lie dormant for a long while yet, whether the League of Villains, having failed once, would regroup for another attempt sooner than anyone hoped, but he understood, walking into class 1A each morning surrounded by classmates who had proven, in the worst possible circumstances, exactly how far their loyalty actually extended, that whatever came next, he would not be facing it as the isolated, secret-carrying boy who had once hidden even the smallest use of his ability from the world around him. He would be facing it as part of something larger, a class, a school, a small, hard-won circle of people who had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to stand beside him rather than away from him, and it was that quiet, steady certainty, more than any single triumph of his training or growing public reputation, that Izuku carried with him as autumn settled fully over the UA campus and the next chapter of his hero course began to take shape on the horizon ahead. 27. The second term at UA began with an announcement that carried considerably more institutional weight than the provisional license exam had, Aizawa informing the class during a Monday homeroom that the coming weeks would introduce the hero course's next major milestone. An extended hero work-study program that would place each student directly under the daily supervision of a licensed professional agency for a period considerably longer and more immersive than any previous internship, real field work, real cases, real consequences, structured deliberately to prepare them for the transition from student to working professional that now sat, for the first time, genuinely within sight. Izuku approached the selection process this time with a different calculus than he had used for his short internship with Gran Torino months earlier. The mountain training camp attack had changed the practical shape of his situation in ways the entire faculty now openly acknowledged, and when the formal offers arrived, considerably fewer in number than the flood that had followed the sports festival but each one noticeably more serious in tone, it was an invitation from the Endeavor Agency, the number 2 hero in the country and by a wide margin the most powerful pro-hero willing to take on a work-study student that term, that immediately drew the closest scrutiny from both Izuku and the faculty overseeing his placement. Aizawa laid out the practical case for it plainly during a private meeting called specifically to discuss the offer, that Endeavor's agency operated with security and resources that few other placements in the country could match, that his own son, Izuku's classmate Shoto Todoroki, would be working the same placement, and that the arrangement offered a rare, genuinely useful combination of elite tactical training and the kind of protective infrastructure that had, until the mountain camp attack, seemed unnecessary but now felt like simple prudence given the confirmed, ongoing interest of an adversary as dangerous as All for One. Izuku, for his part, felt a complicated tangle of anticipation and unease at the prospect. He had watched Endeavor's fire-based Quirk dismantle villain after villain on television for years, had studied his tactics with the same obsessive thoroughness he brought to every hero he admired, but he had also noticed, over months of shared classes, the particular quiet that settled over Todoroki whenever his father's name came up in conversation, a controlled, careful blankness that suggested considerably more complicated history than the polished, public image of Japan's second greatest hero ever let show through. He raised the concern directly with Todoroki himself during a quiet moment after training a few days later, choosing his words with the same careful restraint he applied to using his quirk, asking simply whether Todoroki had any reservations about the two of them working the same placement together, given how rarely Todoroki mentioned his father at all. Todoroki considered the question for a long moment, his expression giving away little, and then answered with the flat, unadorned honesty that Izuku had come to recognize as characteristic of him, that his relationship with his father was complicated in ways he did not particularly want to discuss in detail, but that he had no objection to Izuku joining the same agency, and in fact thought it might, in its own strange way, be useful to have someone else present who understood, at least in broad outline, exactly how difficult his father could be to work under. It was as close to an invitation as Todoroki was likely to offer, and Izuku accepted the Endeavor Agency placement formally the following day, alongside a small handful of other students scattered across various elite agencies throughout the city, Bakugo securing a placement with Best Jeanist that promised its own considerable rigor. Ochako and Tsuyu both accepted at agencies suited to their specific rescue-oriented ambitions, the entire class scattering, for the first time since their admission to UA, into genuinely separate professional environments that would test each of them according to their own individual strengths and weaknesses. The Endeavor Agency's headquarters, when Izuku and Todoroki arrived together for their first official day, occupied an entire modern tower near the center of the city, sleek and imposing in a way that matched exactly the public image Izuku had always associated with the number 2 hero, and Endeavor himself, tall and broad-shouldered with flames flickering faintly along his beard even in casual conversation, greeted the two of them in the agency's central briefing room with an intensity that filled the space almost physically, his attention settling on Izuku with an assessing sharpness that made it immediately, unmistakably clear that this placement was going to demand considerably more than the gentler, more patient mentorship Gran Torino had offered months earlier. "I've reviewed your file thoroughly," Endeavor said, without preamble, his voice carrying the same commanding weight Izuku remembered from countless television broadcasts. A quirk with genuine, significant ceiling, wasted for months on careful half measures because a very cautious upbringing taught you to treat your own strength as something to apologize for. "I don't train half measures in this agency. If you're going to work under me, you're going to learn exactly how far that ability of yours can actually go, and you're going to learn it fast, because the world we're operating in right now does not appear inclined to give either of us the luxury of a slow, gentle education." Izuku, standing straight-backed despite the intensity of the greeting, felt the old, familiar tension between his mother's careful teaching and the sharper, more demanding philosophy Gran Torino had already begun to introduce months earlier, and understood, standing there in that imposing briefing room with Todoroki silent and watchful beside him, that the coming weeks were about to test not just the scale of his ability, but the entire careful architecture of restraint he had spent his whole life building around it. 28. The first 2 weeks of the Endeavor Agency placement proved every bit as demanding as the initial briefing had promised, Izuku and Todoroki both cycling through a rigorous schedule of patrols, simulated crisis drills, and direct combat training sessions with Endeavor himself, whose approach to teaching bore little resemblance to Gran Torino's patient, conversational style. Where Gran Torino had pushed Izuku to trust careful, minimal instinct, Endeavor pushed him relentlessly toward scale, running drills that demanded Izuku hold larger and more sustained alterations for longer stretches than he had ever previously attempted, his stamina tested repeatedly against a threshold Endeavor seemed determined to expand through sheer, unforgiving repetition. "You're thinking about cost before you've even fully committed to the action," Endeavor told him bluntly after one particularly grueling session, Izuku sitting slumped against the training room wall, muscles trembling from an exercise that had required him to maintain a significant terrain alteration across nearly 30 seconds, considerably longer than any single use he had previously sustained. That hesitation might have kept you safe against ordinary threats, but against something like what attacked your training camp, half a second of doubt is the difference between saving everyone in the building and saving no one at all. Push through the doubt in training, here, where the cost is only exhaustion, so that in the field, when it actually matters, the doubt isn't there to slow you down. It was hard, demanding advice, and Izuku found himself, over the following days, quietly grateful for the different, complementary perspective it offered against everything his mother and Gran Torino had already taught him, understanding gradually that the two philosophies were not actually in conflict but formed, together, a fuller, more complete education, restraint and precision from one teacher, scale and sustained commitment from another, each sharpening a different edge of the same fundamental discipline. Todoroki, working alongside him through most of these sessions, proved a quieter but equally valuable presence, his own considerable ice and fire quirk offering Izuku a natural sparring counterpart whose raw power forced genuine creativity rather than easy, comfortable repetition. It was during one such sparring session, both of them thoroughly exhausted and sprawled on the training room floor during a rare break, that Todoroki finally offered, unprompted, a fragment of the history Izuku had sensed but never pushed him to share, mentioning quietly that his father had built the entire Endeavor persona, and by extension much of Todoroki's own upbringing, around a singular, obsessive ambition to surpass all might, an ambition that had shaped every major decision of Endeavor's life, including, Todoroki added with careful, deliberate flatness, the calculated choice of which quirk to marry into his own bloodline. Izuku did not push for further detail, sensing the boundary of what Todoroki was actually willing to share in that moment, but he absorbed what had been offered with the same careful respect he brought to every genuine confidence entrusted to him, and told Todoroki simply that whatever complicated history existed between him and his father, Izuku had watched him, over months of shared training, become someone genuinely, unmistakably his own person rather than merely an extension of anyone else's ambition, and that the observation was not empty comfort but something Izuku had noticed and believed long before this particular conversation gave him the opening to say it aloud. Todoroki was quiet for a long moment afterward, and then, with the faint, rare ghost of something that might almost have been a smile, told Izuku that he appreciated the honesty more than he probably showed, and that working this placement alongside someone who treated him as Shoto rather than as Endeavor's son or Endeavor's rival had turned out to be considerably more valuable than he had expected when Aizawa first suggested the arrangement. Their first genuine field deployment came at the end of the second week, a routine patrol through a busy commercial district that Endeavor assigned them to run independently, under distant supervision, as a test of their readiness to operate with real autonomy. The patrol itself passed without major incident, a handful of minor disturbances handled efficiently between the two of them, Izuku firming unstable scaffolding at a construction site before it could collapse onto the sidewalk below, Todoroki using a precise application of ice to safely halt a runaway delivery cart before it careened into a crowded intersection, and by the time they returned to the agency tower that evening, both of them wearing the particular satisfied exhaustion of a genuinely productive day's work, Endeavor's assessment, delivered with characteristic brevity, offered the first real approval either of them had heard from him since the placement began, a short, gruff acknowledgement that they had both handled themselves competently and that he expected the coming weeks to push them considerably further still. Izuku, walking back toward the dormitory train that evening beside Todoroki in the cooling evening air, found himself reflecting on exactly how much the placement had already reshaped his own understanding of what his training still required, and it was that same reflective, satisfied mood that carried him through the following days, unaware that the quiet, steady rhythm of his work-study placement was about to be interrupted by a name that had, for weeks already, been spreading through the city's hero community with steadily growing alarm, a self-appointed vigilante the press had already begun calling, with grim, uneasy fascination, the hero killer. 29. The reports had been accumulating for weeks by the time Izuku first paid them serious attention, a string of brutal, methodical attacks targeting licensed heroes across several cities, each victim left alive but paralyzed, unable to move for days afterward through some quirk-related mechanism investigators had not yet fully identified, and a pattern in the selection of targets that struck Izuku, poring over the scattered news coverage during a rare quiet evening in the agency's break room, as considerably more deliberate than random villainy typically allowed for. He's not targeting heroes randomly, Izuku murmured, half to himself, spreading printouts of the attack locations and victim profiles across the break room table with the same intent, muttering focus he had once reserved for filling childhood notebooks. Every single one of these heroes has a public record of questionable conduct, excessive force complaints, staged rescues, heroes who built reputations on flash and marketing rather than genuine substance. Whoever's doing this isn't just attacking heroes. He's judging them. Todoroki, glancing over the scattered printouts with growing interest, agreed that the pattern seemed too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, and it was this exact conversation, still unfolding between them, that was interrupted by an urgent alert flashing across the agency's central monitoring system, a report of a hero down in Hosu City, followed within minutes by a second, considerably more alarming bulletin, that the incident appeared connected to a name neither of them had expected to hear attached to their own immediate circle, Ingenium, the celebrated pro-hero and older brother of their classmate Tenya Ida, confirmed among the hero killer's latest victims. Izuku's stomach dropped with immediate, sick understanding of exactly what this news was likely to mean for Ida, whose fierce, unwavering admiration for his older brother had been evident to the entire class since the very first week of term, and it was that understanding, more than any official assignment, that sent him and Todoroki both scrambling for permission to travel to Hosu the moment word reached them, several hours later, that Ida himself had left the city without official sanction, apparently intent on confronting the hero killer directly. Endeavor, when informed of the situation, authorized their departure with unusual speed, his own expression grim as he warned them both plainly that a classmate driven by grief and fury toward a killer this dangerous represented exactly the kind of volatile, high-stakes situation that could end in genuine tragedy if not handled with extreme care, and that their primary objective was not confrontation with the hero killer directly but locating and safely restraining Ida before his own reckless pursuit of vengeance got him killed. The train ride to Hosu passed in tense, anxious silence, Izuku running through every scrap of information he had gathered on the hero killer's methods, cataloging possible defensive strategies with the same obsessive thoroughness that had once filled notebooks purely for the joy of hero analysis, now sharpened by the much more immediate, personal stakes of a friend's safety hanging in the balance. Todoroki, beside him, remained largely silent, though the tight set of his jaw betrayed a tension that matched Izuku's own. They found Ida's trail through a combination of Todoroki's careful questioning of local hero patrol contacts and Izuku's own methodical process of elimination, tracking a series of witness reports describing a young man matching Ida's description moving with grim, focused purpose through Hosu's darker, more industrial districts, and it was in the shadowed alley behind a shuttered warehouse complex, well past sunset, that they finally located him, Ida's engine-enhanced legs crouched and ready, facing down a lean, scarred figure whose presence radiated a coiled, predatory stillness unlike anything Izuku had encountered since the USJ attack. The hero killer turned his attention toward the two new arrivals with unhurried, almost curious deliberation, a long, curved blade held loosely at his side, and studied Izuku in particular with an intensity that carried none of all for one's clinical hunger but something closer to genuine, searching assessment. So the reality bender finally shows himself in person, the man said, his voice carrying a rasping, ritual gravity that made the hair on the back of Izuku's neck rise instinctively. I've watched your footage same as everyone else. A power that could reshape the entire rotten foundation of this so-called hero society, wasted chasing the same hollow fame and empty spectacle that every fraud calling themselves a hero seems so desperate to chase these days. I wonder, watching you now, whether you're going to prove yourself any different from the rest of them, or whether tonight simply confirms what I already suspect. 30. Ida did not wait for the exchange to finish, launching himself forward with a burst of engine-powered speed the instant the hero killer's attention shifted even slightly away from him, grief and fury driving a strike aimed with more raw force than careful technique. The hero killer sidestepped it with the same unhurried economy he had shown throughout the entire encounter, his blade flicking out in a motion too fast for Izuku to fully track, and Ida crumpled to the alley floor a heartbeat later, his legs suddenly, completely unresponsive beneath him, whatever paralytic mechanism the man's quirk employed clearly requiring nothing more than a single, glancing contact to take full, immediate effect. Izuku moved before conscious thought fully caught up with instinct, closing the distance with the same trusted, integrated reflex Gran Torino had spent a week honing in him, reaching for the alley's cracked concrete floor directly beneath the hero killer's advancing feet and willing it, in the same instant, into something loose and treacherous, buying Todoroki the precise half-second he needed to send a wall of ice surging up between the villain and Ida's fallen, paralyzed form. The hero killer's balance faltered against the shifting ground, but he recovered with a speed that spoke of considerable, hard-won combat experience, vaulting sideways to avoid the worst of the destabilization and pressing his attack directly toward Izuku instead, his blade a blur of controlled, purposeful motion that forced Izuku into a desperate series of evasive maneuvers, each one costing precious stamina he could not easily spare against an opponent whose speed and precision matched, in its own violent way, the same disciplined economy Izuku had spent his whole life cultivating in an entirely different direction. Todoroki joined the fight properly then, ice and controlled bursts of flame forcing the hero killer to divide his attention between two opponents, and for several frantic, chaotic minutes the alley became a blur of shifting terrain, freezing ice, and the blade's relentless, searching strikes, until Izuku, watching the pattern of the man's movement with the same analytical focus that had once cracked apart Bakugo's fighting style during the sports festival, finally identified the narrow, exploitable seam in his opponent's technique, a fractional over-reliance on solid, stable footing whenever he committed to a full extension strike. He waited for the opening, forced it, in fact, by deliberately allowing a section of ground to remain firm and inviting directly in the hero killer's likely attack path, and when the man committed to exactly the extended, decisive strike Izuku had been baiting him toward, Izuku dropped the ground stability in the same instant, sending him stumbling forward off balance directly into a wall of ice Todoroki had been holding ready and waiting for precisely this moment. The impact was not enough to end the fight outright, but it was enough, combined with the arrival, moments later, of a wave of pro-heroes finally converging on the alley in response to the wider emergency alert that had by then spread throughout Hosu's coordinated response network, to finally overwhelm the hero killer's remaining resistance, the man taken down in a swift, coordinated final assault that left him restrained and unconscious on the alley floor as emergency medical teams rushed forward to attend to Ida's paralyzed but otherwise stable condition. It was only in the exhausted, adrenaline-draining aftermath, sitting slumped against the alley wall while paramedics worked over Ida a short distance away, that Izuku fully processed the strange, unsettling core of what the hero killer had said to him before the fighting began. The man's twisted, violent ideology built, however monstrously it manifested, around a genuine, searching question about the difference between real heroism and hollow performance, a question that echoed, in its own dark way, considerably closer to the same values Izuku's own mother had spent a decade instilling in him than he found comfortable to sit with. Todoroki, settling down beside him against the same alley wall, seemed to be turning over something similar, and it was he who finally broke the heavy silence between them, observing quietly that a man could ask the right question and still arrive, through violence and cruelty, at entirely the wrong answer, and that recognizing the fragment of truth buried somewhere in a monster's twisted reasoning did not obligate either of them to excuse a single thing the man had actually done with it. Izuku nodded slowly, still catching his breath, and glanced across the alley toward Ida, conscious now and being carefully loaded onto a stretcher, his expression a raw, complicated mixture of grief, relief, and something that looked, even through the exhaustion, like the first fragile beginnings of a harder, more sobering understanding about exactly where unchecked vengeance actually led. It was, Izuku thought, watching his classmate carried away toward the waiting ambulance, a lesson every one of them, himself very much included, was probably going to need to keep relearning in different forms for as long as the road ahead of them continued asking them to carry power heavy enough to genuinely matter. 31. The days following the Hosu incident brought a fresh wave of national attention, considerably more complicated in tone than anything Izuku had experienced after the apartment fire, the capture of a killer who had eluded professional heroes for months, earning genuine, widespread public gratitude even as uncomfortable questions circulated about exactly why two work-study students, rather than the city's own established heroes, had ended up at the center of the confrontation. Endeavor fielded most of the official press scrutiny himself, his agency's formal statement crediting Izuku and Todoroki's intervention while carefully declining to detail the full extent of either student's involvement, a discretion Izuku found himself quietly grateful for even as he understood it could not shield him indefinitely from the wider, growing public fascination with his own unusual quirk. Ida spent several days recovering under medical supervision, the paralytic effects of the hero killer's quirk fading gradually without lasting damage, and it was Izuku who visited him most consistently during that recovery, sitting with him through long, quiet afternoons that carried little of their usual easy classroom banter, replaced instead by something more careful and searching. It was during one such visit that Ida finally addressed the reckless choice that had brought him to that alley in the first place, admitting, with visible difficulty, that grief over his brother's injury had narrowed his thinking to something dangerously singular, a fixation on vengeance that had, for a time, entirely crowded out the more careful, principled reasoning he prided himself on in every other part of his life. Izuku listened without judgment, understanding better than most exactly how completely fear and love for the people who mattered most could override careful restraint in a genuine crisis, and told Ida honestly that he did not think any less of him for the lapse, only that he hoped, going forward, Ida would trust his friends enough to lean on them in moments like that rather than carrying the full weight of it alone. Ida, considering this with the same serious, deliberate care he brought to everything, finally admitted that the lesson had landed considerably harder than any lecture ever could have, and thanked Izuku plainly, without his usual formal flourish, for coming after him rather than simply reporting his disappearance and waiting for official channels to catch up. The wider fallout from the Hosu incident reached considerably further than Izuku initially realized, a fact that became clear roughly a week later when Aizawa called him aside after class to share a piece of intelligence the Hero Public Safety Commission had passed along through official channels. That surveillance of known League of Villains associates had picked up chatter suggesting the organization's interest in the captured hero killer's ideology, rather than diminishing following his defeat, had instead sharpened into active recruitment efforts among the considerable online following his violent, twisted philosophy had accumulated during his months of active terror. It was an unsettling piece of news, and Izuku turned it over carefully in the days that followed, understanding gradually that the League's ambitions had never been confined simply to acquiring his own quirk, that the organization appeared, in fact, to be actively expanding its reach and recruitment in ways that suggested a considerably larger, more coordinated campaign building beneath the surface than the isolated attacks at the USJ and the mountain training camp had initially suggested. He raised the concern directly with Endeavor during their next scheduled training session, and the number 2 hero, listening with the same intense focus he brought to every serious conversation, confirmed grimly that the Commission's own threat assessments had reached similar conclusions, that whatever patient, long-term plan All for One was quietly assembling around Izuku's quirk appeared to be entering a considerably more active phase, and that the coming months were likely to test not just Izuku's individual growth as a hero, but the coordinated readiness of the entire professional hero community to meet a threat considerably larger than any single, isolated confrontation had yet fully revealed. It was sobering counsel, delivered without any softening, and Izuku carried it with him back to the dormitory that evening, finding Ochako waiting in the common room with the easy, familiar warmth that had, over the preceding months, become one of the steadiest anchors in his increasingly complicated life. She noticed his distracted mood almost immediately, and rather than pressing him for details he was not yet ready to share, simply sat with him in comfortable, undemanding silence for a while before finally asking, gently, whether he wanted to talk or whether he would rather she just stayed close until the weight of whatever he was carrying settled a little. Izuku, looking at her steady, patient presence beside him, found himself grateful, not for the first time, that whatever storm continued gathering somewhere beyond the walls of UA, he no longer had to face the prospect of it entirely alone, and he told her, quietly, that just staying close sounded exactly right for tonight, the larger conversation about everything Aizawa and Endeavor had shared waiting, for now, until he had properly caught his breath. 32. In a cramped, dimly lit bar on the far side of the city, considerably less refined than the Endeavor Agency's gleaming tower but no less significant to the plans currently taking shape within it, Shigaraki sat hunched over a low table scattered with the same kind of scavenged surveillance material that had, over the preceding months, grown into a considerable archive dedicated almost entirely to a single subject, and listened, with visibly strained patience, as the gaunt, patched figure seated across from him laid out the shape of an operation considerably more ambitious than anything the League had previously attempted. The Hosu incident, All for One observed, in the same unhurried, almost conversational tone Izuku had encountered in that dark mountain clearing months earlier, had produced 2 genuinely useful outcomes despite the loss of a promising, if crude, ideological asset. It had confirmed, first, that young Midoriya's instinct for combat had sharpened considerably since their previous encounter, precisely the kind of development that made him an increasingly valuable prize rather than a diminishing one. And it had delivered, second, a small but genuinely useful influx of new recruits drawn from the darker corners of the internet, disillusioned admirers of the hero killer's twisted philosophy who required only careful, patient cultivation to become considerably more useful than their scattered, undirected online rage currently allowed. Shigaraki, scratching absently at his own neck in the restless, irritable habit that had grown more pronounced over recent weeks, pressed for something more direct than patient cultivation, arguing that every month spent quietly recruiting and planning gave UA and the Hero Public Safety Commission additional time to tighten security around Izuku that would only make any future attempt at capture considerably harder. All for One considered the objection with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, and conceded, after a long moment, that Shigaraki's underlying instinct was not entirely wrong, that the current, gradual approach did carry genuine risk of the target eventually becoming functionally unreachable through anything short of an overwhelming, large-scale operation. It was that concession, delivered with characteristic calm, that set in motion the planning for what All for One described, with the same clinical detachment he applied to every strand of his sprawling ambitions, as a decisive operation, timed deliberately to coincide with a major public hero event already scheduled within the coming weeks, a gathering that would draw considerable security attention but would also, crucially, draw Izuku himself into exactly the kind of large, crowded, difficult to fully secure environment that a smaller, more isolated venue like the mountain training camp had, in the end, proven too easy for UA to simply lock down entirely. The specific target, All for One explained, laying a single printed schedule across the low table between them, was the upcoming UA-sponsored charity exhibition, an annual event held in the city's largest indoor arena that brought together pro-heroes, hero course students, and thousands of members of the general public for an afternoon of demonstrations, meet and greets, and charitable fundraising, an event whose very purpose, built around openness and public accessibility, would work directly against the kind of tight, comprehensive security perimeter that had successfully repelled the League's previous attempt. Shigaraki studied the schedule with growing, hungry interest, already turning over the tactical possibilities such a crowded, chaotic venue would offer, and asked, finally, exactly what resources All for One intended to commit to an operation of this scale. The answer, delivered without hesitation, confirmed exactly how seriously the shadow figure had come to regard the prize Izuku's Quirk represented, a full mobilization of every asset the League currently commanded, newly recruited hero killer sympathizers included, alongside several of the artificial, engineered combatants All for One's own private research had spent months quietly developing, held in reserve until now for precisely this kind of decisive, high-value operation. This is not a probe, All for One said finally, rising slowly from his seat with the same unhurried, deliberate motion that seemed to characterize everything he did. This is not a message, and it is not a test of the boy's defenses the way our previous encounters have been. This is the operation that ends the waiting entirely, one way or another, and I intend for every single asset at our disposal to be committed toward making certain that when the dust settles, the reality-bending boy who has spent his entire short career squandering that gift on burning buildings and grateful strangers belongs, at last, to something considerably larger and considerably more permanent than the narrow, sentimental world his mother spent so many careful years teaching him to accept as the whole of his existence. The words hung heavy in the cramped, smoke-stained air of the bar, and Shigaraki, listening to them, felt something that might, in a different life, have resembled genuine anticipation, the long, patient months of watching and waiting finally converging toward a single, decisive point, unaware, in his own hungry focus, of exactly how many separate, careful threads of intelligence and preparation Yui's own faculty had already begun quietly weaving together in response to warning signs that had, for weeks now, been steadily accumulating on the other side of the city's carefully guarded walls. 33. The weeks leading up to the charity exhibition passed for Izuku in a strange, dual rhythm, ordinary classwork and continuing endeavor agency training layered over a steadily thickening undercurrent of institutional caution that he could feel accumulating even in details never explicitly explained to him, additional faculty presence woven into his daily schedule, subtle adjustments to his patrol routes, a noticeable tightening in the Commission's communication with UA that Aizawa acknowledged only in the barest, most practical terms whenever Izuku asked directly. It was Nizu who finally, roughly 10 days before the exhibition, called Izuku into a private meeting alongside Aizawa and Director Tsuragi to lay out, with characteristic calm precision, exactly what the Commission's accumulated intelligence suggested was coming. Surveillance and informant reporting, Nizu explained, had identified a marked increase in League of Villains activity over recent weeks, resource acquisition, recruitment, and coordination patterns consistent with preparation for a significant, large-scale operation, and while the Commission could not yet confirm the exact target or timing with absolute certainty, the accumulated pattern of evidence pointed with uncomfortable consistency toward the upcoming charity exhibition as the most likely venue. Izuku absorbed the briefing with the same steady, focused attention he had learned to bring to every serious conversation about his own safety since the mountain camp attack, and it was he, rather than any of the assembled adults, who finally asked the question sitting most heavily beneath the entire discussion: whether canceling his own attendance at the exhibition might simply remove the League's primary incentive for the operation altogether, sparing thousands of ordinary attendees from being caught in the middle of a confrontation aimed, fundamentally, at him alone. Director Tsuragi answered first, acknowledging that the Commission had debated exactly that option at length, but explaining that current intelligence suggested the League's preparations had progressed too far, and involved too many committed resources, to assume a simple change of venue or attendance would meaningfully deter an operation of this scale. That canceling Izuku's own participation risked only delaying the confrontation to a moment and location UA had considerably less warning and preparation time to properly secure. The better strategy, she argued, was not retreat but careful, comprehensive readiness, turning the exhibition itself into a trap considerably more dangerous for the League than for the students and civilians it was ostensibly designed to threaten. What followed was 10 days of the most intensive, coordinated preparation Izuku had ever participated in, faculty from across UA working alongside Commission tactical planners and representatives from several allied agencies, Endeavor's own considerable resources folded directly into the effort to construct a layered security plan built around exactly the kind of controlled unpredictability that had, in every previous confrontation, proven Izuku's own greatest asset. Evacuation routes were mapped and rehearsed. Faculty and pro-hero positioning was arranged with deliberate redundancy, so that no single point of failure could leave any section of the arena genuinely undefended. And Izuku himself, working through repeated tactical drills alongside Todoroki, Bakugo, and a growing circle of classmates who insisted, with characteristic stubbornness, on being included in the preparation despite faculty concerns about placing students directly in harm's way, refined his own role in the plan with obsessive, careful thoroughness. It was Ochako, during one particularly exhausting late-night planning session, who finally voiced the observation that had been quietly building beneath the entire class's determined participation, that none of them, not one single person crowded around the strategy table that evening, had seriously considered simply staying home and letting the adults handle a threat this dangerous alone, and that the unspoken, unanimous agreement on that point told her, more clearly than any single conversation could have, exactly how far their bond as a class had actually traveled since the anxious, uncertain strangers who had first introduced themselves in classroom 1A the previous spring. Izuku, looking around the table at the familiar, determined faces gathered there, Momo's sharp, analytical focus, Bakugo's fierce, unshakable resolve, Tsuyu's calm, steady practicality, Todoroki's quiet, watchful readiness, felt the same grounding certainty settle over him that had carried him through every crisis since the USJ, the plain, hard-won understanding that whatever All for One and his gathered forces intended to unleash at the exhibition, they would be facing not an isolated, vulnerable target but a genuinely unified class of young heroes who had spent an entire year learning, deliberately and repeatedly, exactly how to stand beside one another when it mattered most. The night before the exhibition, lying awake in his dormitory room running through the tactical plan one final time, Izuku found himself thinking not of fear, though fear certainly remained present somewhere beneath the surface, but of his mother's voice, years ago, telling him that the fact he could do something did not mean he should, and Gran Torino's blunter counsel, that trustworthy instinct mattered more than endless careful calculation, and Endeavor's demanding insistence on scale, and Momo's steady, thoughtful framing of restraint as its own particular kind of strength. Every lesson, every mentor, every hard-won piece of the long, careful education that had brought him to this exact point converged, in the quiet dark of that final night, into a single, settled clarity, and Izuku closed his eyes at last, ready as a 16-year-old carrying this much weight could reasonably ever be, for whatever the following day was about to demand of him. 34. The charity exhibition opened, on the surface, exactly as every previous year's event had, thousands of attendees streaming through the arena's main gates beneath a bright, clear afternoon sky, Hero Course students stationed at demonstration booths and meet and greet tables scattered throughout the venue's main floor, the atmosphere carrying the same warm, festive energy that had always made the event one of the city's most beloved annual gatherings. Only the trained eye, Izuku knew, moving through his assigned position near the arena's central demonstration stage with Todoroki close beside him, could have picked out the subtle, deliberate density of plainclothes security woven through the crowd, or the careful, redundant positioning of pro-heroes stationed at every major access point under the guise of ordinary event staffing. The first 2 hours passed without incident, Izuku performing a scaled-down, carefully controlled demonstration of his quirk for an enthusiastic crowd, softening and reshaping a section of demonstration terrain in ways calculated to be impressive without revealing anything genuinely tactical about his full capabilities, and it was during a brief break between demonstrations, sharing a quiet moment with Ochako near the edge of the stage, that the first true sign of trouble arrived, not through any dramatic eruption but through the same sudden, unnatural quiet that had preceded the mountain camp attack, a section of the crowd near the arena's northern entrance falling abruptly, uneasily silent. Izuku's earpiece crackled to life half a second later with Aizawa's clipped, urgent voice confirming what his own instincts had already flagged, unidentified individuals matching league profile signatures converging on multiple entrances simultaneously. And the exhibition's carefully rehearsed contingency plan snapped into motion with the same coordinated precision 10 days of intensive preparation had been built specifically to produce, faculty and pro-heroes moving smoothly into pre-assigned defensive positions while announcement systems began calmly, deliberately guiding attendees toward the rehearsed evacuation routes without triggering the kind of panicked stampede that would have made everyone considerably more vulnerable. The League's opening assault, when it finally broke fully into the open, proved considerably larger and more coordinated than either of Izuku's previous encounters, a wave of recruited hero-killer sympathizers surging through multiple entrances simultaneously alongside several of the hulking, engineered combatants all for one had spent months quietly developing, and it was the sheer scale of that combined assault, more than any single individual threat, that told Izuku, moving quickly into his own defensive position beside Todoroki and a hastily converging group of classmates, exactly how seriously the shadow figure had committed to this particular operation. He fell immediately into the coordinating role his training had increasingly prepared him for, calling out his practiced shorthand across the chaos, directing terrain manipulation to slow the advancing wave of recruits while Todoroki's ice sealed off a secondary access point threatening to let a fresh wave of attackers flank the evacuating crowd. Bakugo's explosive propulsion clearing a path through a knot of engineered combatants with brutal, controlled efficiency, and Momo, arriving moments later with a rapidly constructed set of barrier equipment, reinforcing the evacuation corridor's structural integrity against the mounting chaos. It was, for several frantic, coordinated minutes, exactly the kind of unified, disciplined response 10 days of intensive preparation had been designed to produce, the combined efforts of students and pro-heroes gradually stabilizing the arena's outer perimeter and steadily funneling the bulk of the panicked crowd toward safety, and it was in the relative lull that followed that stabilization, Izuku catching his breath against a support pillar with Todoroki close beside him, that the arena's central floor suddenly, violently erupted in a fresh wave of dark, swirling mist, considerably larger and more concentrated than anything the blue-haired villain had produced in either of their previous encounters. Through it stepped Shigaraki himself, flanked by a pair of the largest, most heavily engineered combatants Izuku had yet seen, and behind them, unhurried and utterly unbothered by the chaos surrounding him, the same gaunt, patched figure from the mountain clearing, all for one's presence settling over the ruined arena floor with the same patient, geological calm he had carried into every previous encounter, and it was his voice, carrying clearly across the sudden, tense hush that fell over the immediate combatants, that confirmed exactly what Izuku had already begun to suspect in the pit of his stomach, that everything the League had unleashed so far, the recruited sympathizers, the engineered combatants, the coordinated multi-point assault, had served only as prelude, carefully calculated to draw out and exhaust exactly the kind of defensive response now scattered thin across the arena floor, clearing the way, at last, for All for One himself to walk directly toward the one prize he had spent the better part of a year patiently, deliberately working to claim. 35. Izuku felt the old, familiar cold dread settle over him at the sight of that patched, unhurried figure advancing across the ruined arena floor, but underneath the dread, considerably more present now than it had been in that dark mountain clearing months earlier, sat something harder and steadier, the accumulated weight of an entire year's careful, deliberate growth, Gran Torino's trusted instinct. Endeavor's demanding insistence on scale, Momo's thoughtful framing of restraint, the practiced shorthand vocabulary that let him coordinate seamlessly with the classmates now converging protectively around him rather than facing this threat alone in the dark the way he had the first time. "You've grown considerably since our last conversation," All for One observed, his raspy voice carrying easily across the tense, watchful distance still separating them. "I confess I find that only makes tonight's outcome considerably more satisfying to anticipate. But I am, above all else, a patient man, and patience of this particular kind has never once failed to eventually collect exactly what it was owed." It was Todoroki who moved first, eyes surging forward in a broad, sweeping wall aimed at slowing the advance of All for One's engineered escorts, and the arena floor erupted, in the same instant, into the largest, most chaotic confrontation Izuku had yet been part of, Bakugo's explosive assault meeting one of the hulking combatants head-on. Kirishima's hardened form absorbing a punishing blow meant to break through toward the students clustered behind him, Momo's rapid construction of defensive barriers buying crucial seconds for the pro-heroes still working to fully secure the evacuation of the arena's remaining civilians. Izuku focused his own efforts on the ground itself, softening and shifting the terrain beneath the advancing combatants with a scale and sustained intensity that would have been unthinkable to him even a few months earlier. Endeavor's relentless training finally paying its full dividend as he held the alteration steady across nearly a full minute of continuous, grinding effort, buying his classmates the stable, controlled battlefield they needed to fight as the coordinated, disciplined unit their year of shared training had built them into. All for One himself did not immediately engage directly, watching the unfolding chaos with the same patient, unhurried interest he brought to everything, until the arena's main doors finally burst open with a force that sent a visible shockwave rippling through the remaining combatants, and through them strode a familiar, towering figure whose sudden arrival sent a fresh surge of desperate hope through every student still fighting on that ruined floor, All Might himself, his presence alone seeming to physically alter the very air of the confrontation, and it was toward him, rather than Izuku, that All for One's attention finally, fully turned. "So you finally show yourself properly," All for One said, and for the first time since Izuku had encountered him, something genuine and considerably less patient flickered across the gaunt figure's expression, an old, deep animosity that spoke of history considerably longer and more personal than anything Izuku had yet been told. "I wondered how long it would take before you inserted yourself into this, old friend. Have you finally come to reclaim what you've spent so many years insisting you never actually wanted for yourself, or merely to interfere, one final time, with something that was never truly any of your business to begin with?" All Might's answer came not in words but in motion, closing the distance between them with a speed that belied his massive frame, and the confrontation that followed, Izuku understood even through the chaos of his own ongoing fight, was not simply another skirmish in the League's broader operation but the culmination of some far older, far more personal history between these two men, a history that had, apparently, been quietly shaping the entire shadowy landscape of organized villainy for years before Izuku himself had ever been born, and it was that staggering, sudden realization, more than the immediate physical danger still surrounding him, that settled over Izuku with the heaviest weight of the entire evening, the plain, sobering understanding that whatever happened in the next several minutes was likely to determine considerably more than his own personal safety alone. 36. The clash between All Might and All for One tore through the arena's central floor with a force that dwarfed everything else happening around it, each exchanged blow sending shockwaves rippling outward strong enough to stagger combatants engaged in entirely separate fights dozens of meters away, and Izuku, catching brief, fragmented glimpses of it between his own continuous effort to hold the battlefield's terrain in his classmates' favor, understood with growing, horrified clarity that he was witnessing something considerably beyond any confrontation his months of hero study had ever prepared him to properly categorize. It was Shigaraki, watching the two titanic figures collide with an expression caught somewhere between hunger and genuine unease, who finally broke away from the periphery of that clash and turned his own attention back toward Izuku directly, apparently deciding that the confusion of the moment offered exactly the kind of opening the league's entire operation had been designed to eventually produce. He advanced with the same casual, unhurried menace Izuku remembered from the USJ, fingers spread in a manner that had, Izuku knew from careful study of commission threat briefings, a decaying, disintegrating effect on anything they made full contact with. Izuku met the advance with everything his year of training had built in him, softening the ground beneath Shigaraki's feet the instant he drew close enough to threaten direct contact, and it was Ochako, arriving at his side in the same critical instant, who added her own quirk to the defense, releasing the weight of a nearby chunk of debris directly into Shigaraki's path with enough force to knock him backward before his decaying touch could find purchase on anything vital. The two of them fought as a coordinated pair for several tense, grinding minutes, Izuku's terrain manipulation denying Shigaraki stable footing while Ochako's gravity control turned every scattered piece of arena debris into an improvised weapon, until a final, desperate combined effort, Izuku firming a narrow column of ground directly beneath Shigaraki at the exact moment Ochako released a heavy support beam's weight above him, finally drove the villain backward in a stumbling, disoriented retreat toward the arena's shattered northern wall. It was in that same chaotic stretch of time, several dozen meters away, that the clash between All Might and All for One finally reached its own violent culmination, a final, devastating exchange that sent both titanic figures crashing through the arena's already ruined support structure, and when the dust and debris finally began to settle, it was All Might who remained standing, breathing hard, one arm hanging awkwardly at his side, blood visible at his temple, but standing nonetheless, while All for One lay motionless amid the wreckage, badly wounded though, as subsequent commission analysis would later confirm, not decisively defeated, his own considerable regenerative and quirk-stealing capabilities already beginning the slow, patient work of preserving him for whatever eventual escape the chaos of the retreating League forces might yet provide. It was Shigaraki's own desperate, coordinated retreat, gathering what remained of his scattered, battered forces and vanishing back through the same dark, swirling mist that had carried them into the arena, that finally, gradually brought the confrontation to its ragged, exhausted close, pro-heroes and remaining faculty moving quickly to secure the wounded All for One before his regenerating strength could carry him beyond their reach, though the shadow figure, even restrained and grievously injured, met their efforts with the same unhurried, unsettling calm he had carried through every previous encounter, offering no resistance and no final words beyond a single, quiet observation, delivered with something that might almost have been satisfaction despite the clear severity of his wounds, that tonight had cost him considerably less than it appeared to have cost the world watching it unfold, and that patience, as he had always maintained, rarely failed to eventually collect what it was owed, even when a particular attempt fell short of its immediate goal. Izuku, standing amid the ruined arena floor in the exhausted, ringing aftermath, watched the Commission's specialized containment team finally secure All for One's restrained form and felt no triumph in the sight, only a heavy, complicated relief tangled tightly together with the plain, sobering understanding that a threat this patient, this deeply rooted in the hidden architecture of organized villainy, had not been ended tonight so much as delayed, its architect wounded and captured but very much alive, and Izuku understood, watching All Might himself finally lower to one knee amid the wreckage, his massive frame trembling with an exhaustion that went considerably deeper than any single battle, that the true cost of tonight's confrontation was only just beginning to reveal itself. 37. The full accounting of the exhibition's aftermath took shape gradually over the following days, a careful, methodical process of medical treatment, official statements, and quiet, exhausted debriefing that felt, to Izuku, like the slow unwinding of a tension that had been building steadily for the better part of a year. No civilian fatalities had occurred, a fact the Commission's official statement emphasized repeatedly, and that Izuku, turning the outcome over in his own mind during long, quiet hours at his mother's bedside table that evening, recognized as nothing short of remarkable given the sheer scale of what had actually unfolded inside that arena. All Might's condition, kept carefully out of public reporting in its full detail, proved considerably more serious than his composed, upright departure from the ruined arena floor had initially suggested, the accumulated strain of the confrontation revealing damage that Recovery Girl, consulted directly by UA's administration, described in grave, measured terms as a significant setback to his long-term physical resilience, though not, she was careful to clarify, an injury that threatened his immediate survival or his ability to continue serving, at least for the time being, in his role as the world's foremost symbol of hope. Izuku visited him 3 days after the confrontation, in a private recovery suite kept deliberately quiet and secure, and found the number one hero sitting upright in bed, thinner and more visibly worn than Izuku had ever seen him, even in his less imposing form, but greeting Izuku's arrival with a warmth that had lost none of its genuine, steady kindness. They spoke for a long while, All Might sharing, gradually and with visible effort, fragments of the history between himself and All for One that Izuku had glimpsed only in shadow during the confrontation itself, a rivalry stretching back decades, built around a fundamental, irreconcilable difference in how each man understood the proper use of extraordinary power, one dedicated to protecting a world he believed genuinely worth saving, the other convinced that same world deserved only to be reshaped according to whatever vision its most powerful inhabitants chose to impose upon it. You understand now, better than I think you fully did before tonight, exactly what kind of shadow has been watching your development this past year, All Might told him, his voice carrying more weight and gravity than Izuku had ever heard from him. He is not defeated. Wounded, contained for now, but a man like that has survived considerably worse setbacks than tonight's across a career spanning longer than either of us have been alive. I tell you this not to frighten you, young Midoriya, but because you deserve the plain truth rather than false comfort, and because I believe, having watched you grow across this past year, that you are exactly the kind of hero capable of carrying that truth without letting it break the steadier, better instincts that have carried you this far already. Izuku absorbed the words with the same careful seriousness he brought to every genuine lesson offered to him, and admitted, honestly, that the confrontation had changed something fundamental in how he understood the scope of what still lay ahead, that he no longer thought of his own growth as training towards some eventual, definable finish line, but as an ongoing, open-ended commitment that would likely keep demanding more of him for as long as figures like All for One continued to exist in the world at all. All Might, listening, offered a tired but genuine smile at that observation, and told him plainly that understanding exactly that, at 16 years old, represented a wisdom considerably rarer and more valuable than raw power alone had ever proven to be, in his own long, considerable experience of the hero world. The visit ended with All Might extending an invitation Izuku had not expected, a suggestion that once his own recovery allowed for it, he would like to begin meeting with Izuku more regularly himself, not as a formal mentor in the structured sense Endeavor or Gran Torino had provided, but simply as someone who understood, from decades of hard-won personal experience, exactly what it meant to carry a power large enough that the whole world eventually came to expect something from the person carrying it, and who wanted, genuinely, to help Izuku navigate that particular weight as it continued to grow. Izuku left the recovery suite that evening carrying a complicated tangle of gratitude, grief, and hardening resolve, walking back across the UA campus beneath a clear, star-scattered sky toward a dormitory full of classmates who had, in the space of a single chaotic evening, proven beyond any remaining doubt exactly how far their collective courage and loyalty actually extended, and it was that steady, grounding thought, more than anything else the long, difficult day had offered him, that carried him the rest of the way home. 38. Class 1A gathered in the dormitory common room the following weekend for what began, ostensibly, as an ordinary study session and gradually, inevitably, dissolved into something closer to the collective, unhurried processing the entire group had needed since the exhibition without quite finding the right moment to properly indulge it. Momo had arranged snacks with her usual careful thoroughness, Mina had insisted on background music low enough not to interrupt conversation but present enough to soften the room's underlying tension, and one by one, textbooks abandoned in favor of quieter, more searching conversation, the class allowed itself, for the first time since the arena floor finally fell silent, to simply sit together and breathe. Ida, still visibly carrying the weight of his own earlier lesson from Hosu, spoke with unusual openness about how strange it had felt watching the exhibition's chaos unfold from his assigned evacuation post, forced by his own recent recovery to remain on support duty rather than the frontline combat role he might once have insisted on, and admitted that the experience had taught him something valuable about trusting his classmates to handle a crisis without him needing to personally throw himself into the center of every single one. Tsuyu offered her own quiet observation, that watching Izuku and Ochako coordinate so seamlessly against Shigaraki had struck her as proof of exactly how much all of their individual training had actually knitted together into something considerably stronger than any of them could manage alone. It was Bakugo, characteristically blunt, who finally addressed the elephant sitting quietly at the center of the entire gathering, turning toward Izuku with none of his usual sharp edge and asking directly how he was actually holding up, given that the entire operation had been aimed, fundamentally, at him from the very beginning. Izuku considered the question honestly, turning it over with the same careful seriousness he gave every genuine inquiry from the people who mattered to him, and admitted that he was still working through most of it, the fear, the strange, complicated grief of watching All Might's condition, the sobering weight of understanding that All for One remained, even wounded and contained, very much a presence still capable of shaping the future. But I'm not carrying it alone, he added, looking slowly around the crowded, familiar room, at Momo's steady attention, Ochako's warm, unwavering presence beside him, Todoroki's quiet solidarity, Bakugo's own fierce, if gruffly expressed loyalty. That's the part that's actually different this time, compared to before I ever met any of you. I know exactly what's still out there, and it still scares me, but I'm not facing it as someone hiding a secret anymore. I'm facing it as part of all of this. The room settled into a warm, comfortable quiet at that, the kind that needed no further words to properly land, and it was Ochako, breaking the silence eventually with her usual bright, determined energy, who declared that whatever came next, whatever All for One or the remaining League forces eventually attempted, Class 1A intended to meet it exactly the same way they had met everything so far, together, and with considerably more preparation than any villain currently operating seemed to give them proper credit for. The evening wound down gradually into easier, lighter conversation, Mina eventually wrangling several reluctant classmates into a genuinely ridiculous card game that had most of the room laughing within minutes, and Izuku, sitting back and watching his friends argue good-naturedly over increasingly absurd game rules, felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since the moment that dark mist first swallowed him in the mountain clearing months earlier, a settled, hard-won peace. That did not erase the weight of everything still ahead but made it, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, genuinely bearable. 39. The following weeks brought a gradual, welcome return to something resembling ordinary rhythm, UA's campus settling back into the familiar cadence of coursework and training even as the wider institutional response to the exhibition continued unfolding in careful, deliberate stages behind the scenes. The Hero Public Safety Commission announced a sweeping review of large-scale public event security protocols, drawing directly on lessons learned from the confrontation, and Nizu, addressing the assembled student body in a rare full school gathering, spoke plainly about the importance of resilience without minimizing the genuine severity of what had happened, striking a careful balance between honest acknowledgement and steady, forward-looking reassurance that Izuku found himself quietly grateful for. Izuku's own public profile, already considerable before the exhibition, grew into something he increasingly struggled to fully process, footage of his coordinated defense alongside Ochako circulating widely despite UA's careful efforts to limit official disclosure, and the resulting wave of public attention carried a different texture than anything he had experienced before, less breathless fascination and considerably more genuine, grounded respect, strangers stopping him occasionally not to gawk at his unusual quirk but simply to offer quiet thanks for a confrontation that could have, by every reasonable measure, ended in considerably greater tragedy than it actually had. It was during this stretch of gradual, hard-won normalcy that Izuku found himself returning, almost instinctively, to the same disciplined habits his mother had instilled in him since early childhood, careful morning stretches, deliberate practice sessions calibrated to sharpen precision rather than simply chase scale, evenings spent reviewing his own performance during the exhibition with the same rigorous, self-critical honesty he applied to every hero he had ever studied. Aizawa, observing this return to disciplined fundamentals during a routine check-in, offered a rare, genuine compliment, noting that Izuku's instinct to ground himself back in careful basics immediately following his largest and most demanding confrontation yet showed exactly the kind of mature, sustainable judgment that separated heroes built for a long, meaningful career from those who burned out chasing the adrenaline of crisis after crisis. Momo, continuing the quiet, steady partnership that had grown between them since their earliest study sessions in the first weeks of term, proposed formalizing the shorthand communication system they had developed together into something more structured, a genuine tactical framework the entire class could study and refine, and the resulting collaborative project, which the two of them worked on steadily over several weeks, eventually drew Aizawa's attention sufficiently that he incorporated an early draft directly into the class's ongoing training curriculum, a small but genuinely meaningful validation of exactly how far Izuku's contribution to his classmates' collective growth had traveled since his own earliest, more isolated instincts toward secrecy and careful restraint. Ochako remained, through all of it, the steadiest and warmest presence in Izuku's daily life, the two of them settling into an easy, comfortable rhythm of shared study sessions, quiet walks around the campus grounds in the cooling evening air, and the kind of unhurried, undemanding companionship that Izuku found himself treasuring more than he entirely knew how to articulate, even to himself. Neither of them rushed to name exactly what the growing warmth between them actually was, content instead to let it develop at its own steady, patient pace alongside everything else demanding their attention, and Izuku found, more than once, that simply sitting beside her at the end of a long, difficult day did more to settle the lingering weight of everything still ahead than any amount of solitary reflection ever managed on its own. It was on one such quiet evening, the two of them sitting together on a bench overlooking the campus's central courtyard as autumn deepened steadily into the first genuine chill of winter, that Ochako finally asked him, gently, whether he had given any real thought to what came next, once this particular stretch of relative calm inevitably gave way to whatever challenge the following term was likely to bring. Izuku considered the question with the same careful seriousness he gave every genuine inquiry, and admitted that he no longer expected calm to last very long at a stretch, not with all for one still alive and recovering somewhere within the Commission's most secure containment facility, and the League's remaining forces still scattered but very much intact under Shigaraki's increasingly determined leadership, but that he had, somewhere across the long, difficult months since his very first day at UA, stopped measuring his own readiness by the absence of danger and started measuring it instead by the strength of what stood beside him when danger inevitably arrived. That's the whole difference, isn't it? Ochako said quietly, leaning her head against his shoulder as the courtyard lights flickered on one by one against the gathering dusk. You used to carry all of it alone because you thought that's what keeping people safe actually meant. Now you know better. 40. The formal announcement arrived on the first genuinely cold morning of the new season, delivered during a homeroom that carried none of Aizawa's usual dry, understated delivery, replaced instead by a rare, direct gravity that immediately told the entire class something significant was coming. The Hero Public Safety Commission, he explained, had concluded its comprehensive review of the exhibition confrontation, and the resulting recommendations, approved at the highest levels of the National Hero Oversight Structure, would reshape the coming year's curriculum in ways specifically designed around the lessons the entire class had helped generate through their own hard-won experience. Advanced tactical coordination training would be formally integrated into the standard hero course curriculum, built directly around the communication framework Izuku and Momo had spent weeks quietly refining. A new, more rigorous crisis simulation program would test students against scenarios modeled explicitly on the layered, multi-point complexity of the League's actual operational patterns, rather than the more simplified, isolated threats previous training had typically featured. And Izuku himself, Aizawa added, with a small, measured nod that carried more weight than any lengthy speech could have managed, had been formally recommended by the Commission for a specialized advanced mentorship track, developed in careful consultation with All Might himself, designed specifically to prepare him for the unique, ongoing demands his particular quirk and its considerable, continuing public attention were likely to keep generating throughout the remainder of his time at UA and well beyond it. Izuku received the news with a quiet, settled kind of pride entirely different from the anxious uncertainty that had once accompanied every previous milestone of his hero training. It did not feel, this time, like validation he needed to prove himself worthy of, but rather like the natural, earned continuation of everything the past year had steadily built in him, the careful restraint his mother had instilled, the trusted instinct Gran Torino had sharpened, the demanding scale Endeavor had pushed him toward, the thoughtful, analytical partnership Momo had offered, the steady, grounding warmth Ochako had given him, all of it converging now into a foundation solid enough to carry whatever the commission's specialized track was actually going to demand of him. The wider class greeted the announcement with the same easy, unforced pride Izuku had come to expect from them, Bakugo's gruff congratulations delivered with characteristic bluntness, Todoroki's quiet, genuine nod of respect, Momo's visible satisfaction at seeing their collaborative framework formally recognized, and it was that collective, unhurried warmth, more than the formal institutional recognition itself, that Izuku found himself carrying with him as he walked out of homeroom that morning into a cold, clear winter sky, the campus around him bustling with the same familiar rhythm of students moving between classes that had, over the course of a single remarkable year, become as thoroughly and completely home to him as the small apartment where his mother still waited every evening with dinner ready and a story to share about her own day. He thought, walking across the quad with Ochako's hand loosely brushing against his own and Todoroki falling into step on his other side, of everything the year had actually asked of him, the fear and the fire, the mountain clearing's cold, patient threat, the ruined arena floor and All Might's trembling, exhausted victory, the long, careful accumulation of trust that had transformed a solitary boy hiding an enormous secret into someone who no longer needed to carry any of it alone. He thought, too, of the quiet, unfinished business still waiting somewhere beyond UA's walls, all for one recovering in careful containment, Shigaraki regrouping his scattered forces, the patient, geological certainty in that gaunt figure's voice that tonight's setback represented delay rather than defeat. But he did not carry that unfinished business the way he once might have, as a solitary, private weight pressing down on him alone in the dark. He carried it now the way he had learned to carry everything that mattered, in the company of people who had chosen, again and again, across a full year of fire and crisis and quiet, ordinary friendship, to stand beside him rather than away from him, and it was that steady, hard-won certainty, more than any single triumph the year had offered him, that Izuku Midoriya carried forward into the next chapter of his training, whatever shape it eventually chose to take. 41. Deep within one of the Hero Public Safety Commission's most heavily secured containment facilities, buried beneath layers of reinforced concrete and quirk-suppressing technology developed specifically for exactly this kind of prisoner, all for one sat motionless in a chair bolted permanently to the floor of a cell designed without a single feature that his considerable, patient intelligence might eventually turn toward escape, and allowed himself, in the quiet, sterile isolation of that confinement, something that might have looked, to any observer unfamiliar with the full scope of his ambitions, like genuine contentment. He had, after all, learned a great deal. The boy's coordination with his classmates had exceeded every projection, a depth of trust and tactical cohesion that spoke of considerably more careful cultivation than a simple, isolated quirk assessment could have revealed. All Might's continued vulnerability, confirmed decisively during their confrontation, offered a different, equally valuable kind of intelligence, proof that the symbol of peace's long, slow decline had finally reached the point where even a single serious confrontation exacted a cost from which full recovery seemed, by every reasonable medical assessment, increasingly unlikely. And Shigaraki, forced by circumstance to lead the League's scattered remaining forces without direct guidance for the first time in the young man's short, violent career, would either rise to the challenge in ways that proved genuinely useful, or reveal limitations worth understanding before any future investment of resources went further. Patience, all for one reflected, settling deeper into the chair's rigid, unforgiving frame, had never once failed him across a career spanning considerably longer than any of the earnest, well-meaning heroes currently celebrating his containment could properly imagine, and confinement, however thorough its physical security, changed remarkably little about the fundamental calculus that had always governed his approach to the world. Plans, properly built, did not require his constant, direct presence to continue unfolding exactly as intended, and the seeds he had spent the past year carefully planting, in Shigaraki's simmering ambition, in the scattered network of recruited sympathizers still operating beyond the Commission's reach, in the patient, ongoing cultivation of resources and contingencies distributed across considerably more locations than any single raid could ever hope to fully dismantle, would continue growing, regardless of the particular room in which he currently happened to be sitting. Above ground, in the considerably warmer light of an ordinary winter afternoon, Izuku Midoriya walked home from his final class of the day with no awareness at all of the patient, unhurried calculations still unfolding somewhere far beneath the city's surface, his attention instead fully absorbed by the easy, familiar company of friends who had, across one remarkable year, become as essential to him as the extraordinary power he had spent his entire childhood learning to carry responsibly. He did not know, and would not know for some time yet, exactly how much further the road ahead was going to demand of him, how many more mountain clearings and burning buildings and crowded arenas still waited somewhere beyond the horizon of his current, hard-won peace. What he knew, walking beneath a clear winter sky with Ochako's laughter carrying warm and bright beside him, with Todoroki's quiet, steady presence at his other side, with the whole remarkable, hard-fought architecture of trust and loyalty and careful, deliberate growth that had transformed a frightened, secretive child into exactly the kind of hero All Might had once suggested he might become, was simpler and considerably more durable than any single victory or setback could shake. He knew that whatever came next, he would not be facing it alone, and that the power he had once feared as a burden too large for any single person to safely carry had become, across this long and difficult and ultimately extraordinary year, something he no longer needed to carry entirely by himself at all. The apartment lights glowed warm and familiar ahead of him as he turned the final corner toward home, his mother's silhouette already visible through the kitchen window, and Izuku Midoriya walked the last few steps of that ordinary winter evening carrying, alongside the vast, careful, reality-bending power that had shaped his entire life, the quieter, steadier, considerably more valuable gift of knowing exactly who stood ready to walk the next difficult stretch of road beside him, whenever it eventually, inevitably arrived. 42. All Might's recovery progressed slowly over the following weeks. Each visit Izuku made to the modest apartment the retired portion of his life had begun quietly occupying, revealing a little more strength returned, a little more of the old, familiar warmth restored beneath the visible toll the confrontation had taken. Their conversation settled gradually into a genuine rhythm distinct from anything Izuku's other mentors had offered him, less structured training and considerably more patient, wide-ranging discussion, All Might sharing hard-won perspective on decades spent carrying public expectation at a scale Izuku himself had only begun, over the past year, to properly understand from the inside. It was during one such visit, the two of them sharing tea at a small table while late afternoon light slanted warm through the apartment's narrow windows, that All Might raised a subject he had apparently been considering carefully for some time, asking Izuku directly whether he had thought about what kind of agency, what kind of daily practice of heroism, he actually wanted to build for himself once his years at UA finally came to their close. Not the abstract, sweeping ambition of childhood daydreams, All Might clarified, but the specific, practical shape of a working life spent wielding a power this unusual and this demanding, day after ordinary day, long after the drama of any single confrontation had faded from public memory. Izuku considered the question with real seriousness, turning over everything the year had taught him, Gran Torino's instinct, Endeavor's discipline, Momo's careful precision, Ochako's steady warmth, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that an answer had already been quietly forming in him without his fully noticing its arrival. He wanted, he said slowly, an agency built around exactly the principle that had guided him since childhood, prevention over reaction, the careful, unglamorous work of noticing danger before it fully arrived rather than simply answering it once the damage had already begun, and he wanted to build it, eventually, alongside people who understood that kind of quiet, patient heroism as fully as he did rather than chasing only the visible, headline-grabbing rescues that tended to define most public conceptions of what a great hero actually looked like. That is, All Might told him, with the same genuine warmth that had first drawn Izuku to admire him as a small child watching grainy rescue footage on television, exactly the kind of answer that tells me you have already become the hero this world is going to need most, considerably sooner than either of us probably expected when you first sat in that conference room a year ago answering nervous questions about the exact limits of what your quirk could do. The conversation drifted, as their conversations increasingly did, toward lighter territory before the visit finally wound to its close, All Might sharing an old, faintly embarrassing story from his own early training years that left Izuku laughing properly for the first time in what felt like weeks, and it was that same easy, contented mood that carried him back through the cooling evening streets toward the train station, his mind pleasantly unburdened for once by the weight of ongoing threat or lingering uncertainty. He found Ochako waiting for him at the station platform, having finished her own agency shift nearby and texted, with characteristic thoughtfulness, to suggest they simply ride home together rather than separately, and the two of them spent the short journey trading small, unremarkable details of their respective days, the easy, comfortable intimacy of two people who no longer needed grand gestures to feel genuinely close to one another. Izuku told her, haltingly at first and then with growing warmth, about the conversation with All Might, about the shape of the future he had found himself describing almost without planning to, and Ochako listened with the same rapt, genuine attention she brought to everything that mattered to him, telling him finally, as the train pulled into their stop, that whatever agency he eventually built, whatever shape his particular vision of prevention over spectacle ultimately took, she fully intended to still be standing somewhere close beside him when it happened, exactly the way she had been standing beside him, in one form or another, since the very first day a falling beam had brought the two of them together. It was a small, quiet promise, offered without fanfare on an ordinary train platform at the close of an ordinary day, but Izuku carried it with him nonetheless, walking the last stretch home beneath a sky slowly darkening into the deep, clear blue of early winter night, and understood, with the same settled, hard-won certainty that had carried him through everything the past year had asked of him, that whatever challenges still waited somewhere further down the long road ahead, he was walking toward them now considerably less alone, and considerably more ready, than the frightened, secretive boy who had once stood trembling on a curb outside a mock city, wondering whether the world could ever learn to trust a power as vast as the one he carried. Thanks for listening.